Peace, family. Y'all know who it is. It's Bakari Lumumba back once again, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. Back once again with another provocative conversation that we're going to have with our resident historian, Pan-Africanist historian, Brother Dwayne Omowale. And we're going to be discussing and honoring, not only today is the 73rd birthday of Africa's Che Guevara, also known as Thomas Sankara. But we're going to honor the legacy of Thomas Sankara. If many of you are unaware, Thomas Sankara is the 5th president of Burkino Faso, and his administration took place from 1983 to 1987. He's considered one of Africa's lost leaders, but I would argue maybe one of his most influential leaders. And so we're going to have a great conversation regarding that. If you're watching, make sure you hit the thumbs up button. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. So also, as we always do, we go over the ground rules here at Lumumba Speaks. And of course, we believe in diversity of thought. So if you have an opinion that is different from myself or my guest, please feel free to tap in and share your perspective. Also, no racial epithets of any kind can be used, irrespective of one's geographic place of origin. Of course, facts over feelings. We want to argue. We want to attack the argument, not, of course, the person. Of course, last but not least, you cannot make any claims that are fundamentally false. And we always start off with this note by stating our mission here at Lumumba Speaks is not to vilify or exonerate, but to simply challenge conventional thinking and re-examine what has previously been accepted as fact. Also, and honoring the life and legacy of Africa's Che Guevara, also Thomas Sankara, we want to invoke the wisdom of our ancestors. And we know that Queen Mother Fannie Lou Hamer, many of you may be unaware, but Queen Mother Fannie Lou Hamer, of course, was one of the leaders, preeminent leaders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And she taught us two things. One, to never forget where you come from, and always praise the bridges that carried you over. And one of those bridges that we're going to praise today, of course, is Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara. So with that being said, we're going to ask our great brother, our resident historian, the preeminent historian when it comes to the Pan-Africanist movement and of African history, Brother Dwayne Omowale, to tap in. You can introduce yourself, let people know how they can reach out to you, and give us a little background about yourself as well.
All right, yeah. So, like you said, my name is Dwayne Omowale. I'm a Pan-African historian, scholar, and activist. I've published 23 books so far on the history and historicals of African people, and one of the books that I published is actually a chapter in there on Thomas Sankara. So he's someone who was greatly influential to myself. So I'm very excited to be here tonight to discuss his impact and his legacy on the Pan-African movement.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're going to dive right in. So Thomas Sankara, if you could give us a little background on his upbringing and how he of course came to power.
Yeah, so his story is actually it's very fascinating because he came through the military. So his introduction to organization and even to some of the Marxist ideals that will later influence him moving forward was primarily through the military. And what's so fascinating about Thomas Sankara, given this military background, is that typically in Africa, when we think of a military coup, the military seizing power, it tends to be a very negative thing because that accompanies a lot of corruption, a lot of very oppressive and repressive tactics. Because after all, it is the military. So what is unique about Thomas Sankara, given his military background, is the type of administration that he was able to foster after coming into power in what was essentially a military coup. And it's also important to look at the political situation in Burkina Faso at the time that he came to power, because the nation wasn't even known as Burkina Faso. It was known as Upper Volta, and that was the French colonial name. So one of the transformations that happened when Thomas Sankara was in power was renaming the country to Burkina Faso, which is an indigenous African name. And that's one of the many things he did to break that French colonial influence. So he came into a situation where, as I said, he was coming from a military background, seizing power in what was, I wouldn't even say a neo-colonial state. Burkina Faso at that point was very much still colonial, very much still attached to France. Because when we speak about neo-colonialism, we think of it as an arrangement where African nations have a degree of political independence, and the real power and the real economic, particularly economic power, real power lies in the hands of European nations. But with the French situation, France has always maintained a very closer grip over its former colonies than the other colonial powers have been. So I think when we talk about neocolonialism in the French colonies is much more closer to the actual classic colonialism than we see in other former colonies. So that was the type of environment that Thomas Sankara came to power into.
Got you. So let's talk a little bit about he made some promises when he came to power. We know that unfortunately the stereotype about many who come to power via a coup is that they are going to create a power vacuum in which they keep all of the resources for himself. He did not do that, but he also made some rather distinct promises regarding his administration. And could you share what some of those promises were and what was unique about his administration compared to others who had a military background that rose to, of course, the presidency in many African nations after colonialism?
Okay, so I'll start with the promises, and I was actually excited to get to this point. I wrote notes before,
as well you should have. I did as well. Yes.
So, but one of the notes I put down, there's the previous administration, Guyana, where I'm from in South America, that the government that came to power in 2015 was another type of government that made lots of promises about how they were going to improve corruption in the country, improve the lives of the citizens. And one of the things they did that made me quickly fall out of favor with that government, shortly after they came into power, they increased their own salaries by 50%. Mm-hmm. What was unique about Thomas Sankara is he made a lot of promises that he actually fulfilled. And why I mentioned the Guyanese situation is that typically in these type of situations, when a government makes these promises and they come to power, you find that they do those sort of things, increasing their own salaries and breaking those promises. Thomas Sankara put the burden on himself and other members of the government. So when he came to power, he actually started, cutting salaries for ministers in the government. There was an arrangement where if you work for the government, you can drive, expensive cars. Mm-hmm. So what he essentially did, and this is very unique in these type of nations, he essentially implemented austerity for the government as opposed to austerity for the masses, which is typically the situation. And that happened in Guyana as well. Not only did the government increase its salary, but also started raising taxes and put the burden on the masses. So what made Thomas Sankara unique is that he actually fulfilled those promises, and in doing so, he put a lot of burdens on the government. And you mentioned the point about the military government. As I said before, Thomas Sankara was very unique in that regard because typically when you look at the history of military coups and military governments in Africa, they tend to be highly repressive, tend to be very corrupt. And why Thomas Sankara is unique in this regard, and he himself kind of alluded to what made him different, he viewed the military not as an institution of abuse and an institution where you take power and you use the gun to oppress the masses. He made the point that in his view, a soldier without any ideological training is a potential criminal. Absolutely. So he understood when you're dealing with military organization, it's not enough to just hand a gun to someone and say, okay, you've got the gun, now you've got power. To him, there was an ideological backing to it. So the military wasn't just about having the weapons and having that type of repressive force that civilians don't have. It was also an ideological approach to it as well, and that's one of the things that made him unique, not only from the perspective of a military government, but as I'm sure we'll get to later, he was also unique from the perspective of a Marxist-Leninist government, because typically around that time period, a lot of leaders in Africa and globally, a lot of those leaders who claimed to be Marxist-Leninists or were influenced by Marxist-Leninist ideas also adopted the Soviet Union's policy of having a very repressive, almost dictatorially oppressive and very violent government. And there were certain autocratic tendencies in Sankara's government, but for the most part, when you compare his government to other Marxist-Leninists at the time, you don't find that he was as repressive as well. For example, he wasn't carrying out a large number of political assassinations and the type of purges that you saw in other similar type of regimes. So given the circumstances behind how Sankara came to power, he was very unique in governing the country the way that he did.
Absolutely. And just for everyone who's watching, my son's favorite Pan-Africanist is Thomas Sankara, right? And maybe it's the military background, because I know he wants to kick my derriere when he gets older, right? But yes, Brother Bikolan, he put in the chat, a soldier without any political or ideological training is a potential criminal. And I would even teach my children that a Black person without any political or ideological training is a potential Negro. Right. So this is something that I taught my children, that if we do not have the proper political and ideological training, we are not only harmful to ourselves, but we are we do harm to our entire race as a people. So I think that's a great point there. But also, Sankara's administration focused on self-sufficiency. And what's rather unique is oftentimes we see African heads of state, they promote the rhetoric. We could talk about one, Idi Amin. His government was repressive in nature. He promoted a lot of Pan-Africanist rhetoric. He spoke ill of the West, but he actually did harm to his own people. But with Sankara, we saw that there was a focus on self-sufficiency, in which he actually went out with the people and rolled their hands up and went to work, right? So if you could share with us a little bit about the self-sufficiency focus and how that was able to manifest during his administration.
Yes, and again, I feel like I say this a lot about Sankara, but it's true that even when we talk about self-sufficiency and self-reliance and self-determination, Sankara was again very unique in that regard. And in my personal view, I would put Sankara as being the best African leader that we've had in the post-colonial time period. And one of the reasons why I would make that argument is that a lot of what we talk about as Pan-African nationalists, Sankara actually implemented, including self-reliance, self-determination. That obviously is a Garveyite principle, but that principle dates back even before Garvey when we're talking about the Black nationalist ideology. We can go back to Martin Delany, and Martin Delany was also talking about the importance of self-reliance. So that was Thomas Sankara's view, and one of the things that Sankara recognized was that, as I mentioned before about how neocolonialism operates. So Sankara recognized that the foreign aid that Africans are given was a form of colonialism. It was a form of imperialism. It was a form of control over African people. And Thomas Sankara had another quote about "He who feeds you controls you."
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. He who feeds you usually imposes his will upon you. And I would always jokingly say that's what my children listen to me because I feed them, right? So they don't eat. So
but that's very real. And Amos Wilson made the point about the rat in the Skinner box. He said, when you look at how a Skinner box works, the person operating the Skinner box can get the rat to do whatever he wants because ultimately the rat needs to eat to survive. So if the rat knows that engaging in a particular behavior is gonna, the rat's going to obtain food by doing this behavior, the rat's more likely to engage in that behavior. And then Amos Wilson said on a broader scale, that's essentially the condition of Black people. When you look at the ghettos in the United States, those are Skinner boxes. I think he even made the comparison to African nations receiving aid from the West being Skinner boxes. So Thomas Sankara probably was the most successful African leader in terms of being able to break that dependency on the West to the point where when he went to a conference for the OAU, that was the predecessor to the current African Union that we have, he boasted that all the clothes that he wore were manufactured in Burkina Faso. He encouraged his people to wear clothes that they produce locally. He encourages people to grow food locally and to eat what they produce. So, his philosophy was that African nations have enough resources to produce much of what they need. There's no reason why you should be importing something that you could produce locally. And even in terms of infrastructure, one of the projects that Thomas Sankara undertook was building a railroad across the country, and that was something that was built, locally with the people of Burkina Faso actually coming out and building it themselves. Now, typically, when African nations try to, implement these large, infrastructure projects, foreign powers have to come in to do it. So, in a modern context, we see China's building up throughout Africa, but also in the past, we've seen examples of Western countries, including the United States. And the final point I'll make on self-reliance, that one of the great mistakes I would argue that Kwame Nkrumah made was his one of the big projects of his government was building the Volta Dam. And the problem with that project was that he had to rely on a lot of Western aid and Western technological knowledge to build that project. So that was a project that was essentially controlled by the Western powers. And they used that as leverage against Nkrumah because they knew Nkrumah needed that foreign aid and that foreign support to build the dam. So that became a way that Western powers tried to leverage control of Nkrumah's government. Now, ultimately, they didn't feel like they had enough leverage, so they had to step in and overthrow him. But, Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, a lot of that generation of Pan-African nationalist leaders, even though they articulated the idea of self-determination and self-reliance, many of them were, very much reliant on financial aid for their projects.
Absolutely. So we'll very quickly, before we move on to his perspective on women's rights, literacy. So part of this concept and idea of self-sufficiency in Burkina Faso focused on literacy. Before Thomas Sankara came to power, unfortunately, Burkina Faso was one of the most illiterate nations in West Africa. He, of course, changed that. Could you talk about how?
Yeah, so I mean, again, that was another one of the policies that he implemented to improve the lives of the people of Burkina Faso. Pushed education, literacy. Just his approach to development in the country was really at a very grassroots level. So he analyzed all of the problems in the country, and literacy was one of them. But it wasn't just literacy, as I mentioned before. Food self-reliance was another thing that Thomas Sankara engaged in, because prior to getting there, the food was, the country was very food dealing with the problem of food deficiency. That was a serious issue as well. So that just shows the level of concern that Sankara had for the masses of his country, that he recognized those issues, and he really put a lot of emphasis on addressing those problems. So literacy was one of those topics as well. But what I will also add with the literacy was that, again, this was a situation where Thomas Sankara recognized that he was inheriting a colonial education system. So he understood that it wasn't just enough to push literacy among the masses of people, but that his people need to be educated to be African people, both ideologically in a revolutionary sense, but also culturally. So part of that literacy campaign was really a campaign to re-educate African people.
Absolutely. But a big Qualan put in the chat, in the space of 4 years, Thomas Sankara planted 10 million trees, vaccinated 2 million kids against meningitis, yellow fever, built roads and railways without foreign aid. So this was a huge issue in terms of redistributing the wealth. And as we know, government officials, they couldn't fly first class. They had to turn in their fleet of Mercedes Benzes, and they were driving economy cars, flying coach. And of course, many took umbrage with these type of reforms that Thomas Sankara felt were part of the revolution, right? And so we would get into that. But let's talk about his view on women's rights, right? We know oftentimes, unfortunately, African nations, African leaders are seen as being repressive, behind the 8 ball when it comes to ideas of women's rights. But that wasn't the case with Thomas Sankara.
Yeah, Thomas Sankara's view was that the liberation of African women was a necessary component of the revolutionary struggle. And I mean, towards that extent, he implemented a lot of policies such as outlawing forced marriages and polygamy, which I found particularly interesting because when we discuss polygamy, that is an African tradition.
Yes.
So one of the aspects that I find interesting with Thomas Sankara's government is that, on the one hand, he's upholding African traditions and African culture in the face of colonialism, but he's also recognizing that there are certain problems as well in traditional African cultures, and he believes that polygamy is one of those problems because polygamy and forced marriages kind of create an arrangement where there's an inequality and men are given too much power over women. So part of his policy was addressing certain traditional African customs that he felt were antiquated. But he went even further. So, for example, we spoke about literacy. Education was another area where Thomas Sankara implemented certain reforms to benefit women. So before he was in power, there was a tradition where girls who became pregnant in high school were forced to leave school, and he implemented a policy where the girls could continue having getting the education even if they were impregnated in high school. And he made the comment that one of his issues with the policy of expelling women who are girls who were impregnated was that the onus was always on the girls and never on the boys that got them pregnant. So whoever it was that got the girls pregnant were then free to continue their education and impregnate other girls as well. So he was looking at certain practices and cultural traditions that created a structure of inequality between the sexes. So one of the more humorous aspects of the policies that he implemented was he made it where during certain days men actually had to go to the marketplace to get food supplies. And why that was funny,
so-called women's work,
but why it was funny, because traditionally that was seen as women's work, but when the men actually went to the marketplace, that's when the men finally found out the cost of certain items that they're buying at the marketplace, because society was so segmented that basically men went did whatever work, and the women took the money, went to the marketplace and spent the money. So Thomas Sankara was really reversing the roles in a way to bring about an equality between the two. And as I said, Thomas Sankar's view was that the liberation of women was a necessary component to the advancement of African people. And I mean, that even goes back to the point of, literacy as well, because one of the problems we see, not just in Africa, but globally, whenever you're dealing with an oppressed people and impoverished people, one of the issues becomes women who are highly illiterate and are raising children tend to raise children who are also illiterate, or have to face obstacles in terms of education. So Thomas Sankara also recognized that in educating the woman, you're really educating the children as well. So there was also a very practical reasoning behind why he implemented those policies to empower women, because he felt empowering women was the key to empowering children, and in doing so, empowering the next generation.
Absolutely. So speaking of children, you could seemingly argue that Thomas Sankara left no stone unturned during his presidency, during his administration, in which, of course, they were bringing about the revolution of course, African people, starting with Burkina Faso. You mentioned children. Talk to us about the pioneer movement.
Yeah. So the pioneer movement, and I mentioned before about ideological training. So that wasn't just being done with the adults. There was a whole pioneer movement training children in the ideals of the revolution. And why this is so critical and is very important for us as Pan-Africanists today to understand this. Thomas Sankara recognized that not only is it important to train children because you're training the next generation, the people who are going to take charge and lead the revolution moving forward, but it's also particularly important to get children because adults are very much hit or miss in terms of political education. You could try to give political education to an adult. In some situations, it'll work. In many situations, the adult is already too, indoctrinated or too far set in his or her ways to really take on those values. So that's the importance of educating children, that
Absolutely.
Children are very easily molded. So, when you give those values to a child, it's much more effective than trying to train or give political education to an adult who's already indoctrinated.
Absolutely. And as they say, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? So I think that is a great point. Once again, Thomas Sankara, his administration, his revolution, in my opinion, was holistic in nature, right? So we look at the economy, we look at self-sufficiency economically, we're looking at women's rights, we're looking at political reform, slashing salaries of top aides, top public officials, not living high off the hog, as they would say. But also he was ahead of his time when it came to ecological awareness.
Yeah.
If you could touch base on that.
Yeah, he was very much ahead of his time. One of the many policies that he implemented was the tradition of planting trees across the country, and he was doing so to fight the desertification process that is still an issue in Africa today. So I always think about Thomas Sankara and his policies regarding the environment whenever I read stories about the problems of desertification in certain parts of Africa. Whenever I see stories about climate change, certain rivers are drying up in Africa, and it's making it very difficult for people who rely on the rivers for their well-being and for their livelihood. For example, if you're a fisherman, a river drying up could be detrimental to what you do to make a living. And famines as well. Whenever I see stories about famines in Africa, I always think about Thomas Sankara's policies. So that's what's so fascinating about Sankara, that many of the policies he was implementing in the 80s, Africa is in dire need of today. But what I will add too about the policy he had with planting trees, I found this one rather interesting, because Thomas Sankara pointed out that in African culture, there was a belief that the trees possessed spirits, a mystical spirit. So that gave the trees a degree of protection. People didn't, just go in there and destroy forests and chop down trees out of this belief.
Mm-hmm.
He pointed out that one of the consequences of that tradition kind of fading away and modernism taking hold is the lack of respect for trees. So now, if you don't view a tree as having these mystic powers or having these spirits, you can cut them down and it doesn't mean anything to you. You wipe out a whole forest and it doesn't mean anything. And why this struck me as being interesting is that Thomas Sankara was pointing out that even when we look at African traditions that might seem superstitious to us in a modern context, there was a very rational or practical basis for why those beliefs were held.
Absolutely. So Although there were several reforms, the nation seemed to be headed in the right direction. There were several individuals in Burkina Faso that took umbrage with Sankara's administration and his revolution, particularly the elites. Could you touch on that?
Yeah, that was really the biggest problem. The elites and the opposition from the elites came mainly in two different forms. The one which ultimately ended up destroying the revolution was the issue with people within the military who felt like they wanted to take power so they could do the typical type of thing that I mentioned before that military governments do when they seize power to, take care of themselves, make sure that they're living in the biggest houses, driving the most expensive cars at the expense of the masses. So there was that element within the government of Burkina Faso at the time that wanted to seize power to enjoy the benefits of being in government. But there was also pushback from elites who weren't necessarily part of the government, and Thomas Sankara mentioned this on them in his book, or the book that compiled many of his speeches and interviews. Thomas Sankara speaks. One of the things that was mentioned in there was the pushback that Thomas Sankara received from the so-called educated elite. These were Africans who, yes, that's the book right there. So in that book, he discusses that there was an elite in Burkina Faso and many other African nations of people who went to Europe, particularly France, and were educated there. So they had a lot of issues with the policies that Thomas Sankara was implementing because they saw that Sankara was, in a sense, severing the connection between Burkina Faso and France, and they still had that cultural and psychological connection to France. So he also received pushback from the educated elite, the academics, and those type of segments of society as well.
Absolutely. So let's talk about his relationship with neighboring countries, particularly the Ivory Coast, also known as Cote d'Ivoire.
Yeah. So that was not a good relationship at all because Cote d'Ivoire at the time was led by Felix Houphouët-Boigny, and he was. I mentioned before about how tight the French grip on the former colonies were. He was a typical example of that. He was very close with France, and he served the French colonial interest throughout that region of Africa. So obviously, given the type of things that Thomas Sankara was engaged in, it made him it created a very adversarial relationship between himself and the government of Cote d'Ivoire at the time, because, as I said, Cote d'Ivoire was very much the typical example of a neo-colonial state led by a leader who was still very much attached to France and pursuing the French policies in Africa.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, of course, during this time, the word of Sankara has gotten out. Many other African nation head of states have become familiar with Sankara. They see him more so as a threat, right? Because people in their country are now saying, hey, why aren't you doing what Sankara is doing? But his legend also spread to the West, right? And so, of course, at 80, I think it was at 86 or 87, he was denied official state visit to the White House, sit down with Ronald Reagan because of his Pan-Africanist ethos. And so he took a legendary visit to Harlem, New York City, right? Where he spoke at, and correct me if I'm wrong, Harriet Tubman Middle School.
Yeah.
And if you could share with the audience about that historic speech that he gave at Harriet Tubman Middle School in Harlem, New York City.
Yeah, when I think of the legacy and impact of Thomas Sankara, I think that definitely was a moment that really stands out in my mind for a number of reasons. Because, I mean, as you said, he was very much viewed as a threat by Western governments, and that speech demonstrated why. And in the same speech, he made reference to Maurice Bishop. Maurice Bishop was a similar type of figure. He was a revolutionary leader in Grenada who was ultimately assassinated. And one of the similarities between the two men, Maurice Bishop said this himself. He pointed out that the government of the United States was very uncomfortable with the revolutionary government in Grenada. One of the reasons why they were uncomfortable, they didn't want what Bishop and the Grenadians were doing to set an example for Black Americans.
Right.
So they were very uncomfortable with that connection. Thomas Sankara visiting Harlem reinforced the fact that when you have a revolutionary leader outside of the United States coming into the United States, connecting with Black Americans, speaking to Black American audiences, it's going to influence those audiences, and it's going to create a tendency among the audiences to engage in the type of revolutionary activities that the leader is speaking about. And I remember years ago, I came across an article that actually quoted, I believe it was a janitor who was in attendance for Thomas Sankara's speech, and he said after listening to Sankara, he felt pride in himself as a black man.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the type of impact that Sankara's speech had on the audience. It made the people who listened to that speech very proud of their identity. And Sankara said in that same speech, never be ashamed of being an African. So in that speech, Sankara was displaying the very things that the United States government was uncomfortable about when we talk about the Pan-African movement. This idea that Black people in the US can connect with Black people outside of the US and build a revolutionary movement that's going to influence each other. And that was his goal, because in that same speech that Sankara gave, he actually invited the Black Americans from Harlem to go to Ghana, because at the time Ghana and Burkina Faso were very close countries, and they were doing military drills together. So he's inviting Black people from Harlem to go get some military training in West Africa. So you could imagine there was a lot of people in the White House that weren't happy about that particular idea. But that speech also stood out to me because Sankara really did a great job of articulating the connection between the Black American struggle and the struggle that he was fighting in Burkina Faso and the struggle throughout Africa. And two of the points that he made that stood out to me in this regard, he mentioned about politicians. He made a comment that Black politicians need to be with Black people, 24/7. They have to be Black, day and night. They can't engage in the type of thing that they typically engage in, where they're Black only when it's election time and they need votes. And it's interesting because in the United States, obviously, Black people recognize that we have a class of political leaders who only speak to Black interests or speak to Black people when they need votes. Then they get elected and you never hear from them again until the next election comes out. And it's the same situation in Africa. A lot of African leaders don't care about the masses of their people until it's election time. Then they start making promises, then they start going to the community. So in that statement, Sankara is pointing out that the same type of political leadership that we have in the United States is the same type of political leadership that we have in Africa. So it's a very similar struggle against that type of mentality and thinking among people who are supposed to be leaders of the community. But the second point of similarity is that when Thomas Sankara was there, he noticed there was a red, black, and green flag. Mm-hmm. And he made the comment that his flag is the same thing. The only difference is he didn't have the black in the flag of Burkina Faso, because Burkina Faso is already on the African continent. And that was interesting to me, because that was when I heard that speech for the first time, that was the first time that I became aware that there are flags, national flags on the African continent that were inspired by Garvey's red, black, and green flag. So even though Garvey's movement was, started in the diaspora, started in Jamaica and spread throughout the diaspora, it spread to Africa as well, to the point where when African nations were becoming independent, many of them adopted flags that were influenced by Garvey's red, black, and green flags. So it's interesting because that demonstrated that Thomas Sankara could go to a Pan-African institution in Harlem and see that flag, and he's thinking it's similar to his national flag because it represents the same Pan-African struggle. So in that speech in Harlem, Sankara really articulated the similarities that Black Americans and people on the African continent face, and also the historical connection between the Pan-African movement in the diaspora and the Pan-African movement on the continent.
Wonderful, wonderful. And you mentioned something about being Black during the day and at night. And I know that in that speech, which is on my channel, so if you're watching, make sure you hit the subscribe button, make sure you smash the like button, thumbs up, as well as hit the notification bell. But one thing he mentioned, he stated that for the African Revolutionary, my White House is in Black Harlem.
Yeah.
Right. And then, of course, he stated that they were in solidarity. Right.
Yeah.
But when you talk about being Black during the day and at night, the next day he went and spoke at the United Nations. And he gave almost verbatim the same speech.
Yeah. And right? He said he was going to, too, and he did it.
Yeah. So when we talk about someone who kept their word, someone who wasn't just Black when it was convenient, when he was Black folk, but then talked out both sides of the mouth and said something different around, of course, them folks. This man was truly a man of principle, right? But with that being said, not everything went well during his presidency, during his revolution. He was accused oftentimes of being autocratic.
Yeah.
He was accused oftentimes of being poor at delegating to his aides in terms of the initiatives that the revolution was looking to implement. Wanted to know if you could comment on that.
Yeah, that's actually one of the notes that I wrote here, that he was very much criticized for being autocratic, and that's one of the situations where you could speak on it. It's easy to speak on it when you're outside that situation, but when you're in the situation, it's much more difficult. So one of the examples that came to mind in terms of displaying an example of the autocratic tendencies that he had as a leader was there was a teacher strike in the country.
Mm-hmm.
How he handled it was by firing the teachers who were striking. Now that created a problem of a shortage of teachers in the country. So now the government had to rush, and I think it was a 10-day program. They had implemented a very short term program to educate teachers to fill the vacancies left by the teachers that were fired. So on the one hand, you could criticize that and say, well, that was a very impulsive action by an autocratic government that ended up harming the educational policy in the country by creating a shortage of teachers. But in that same book that you were just displaying, Thomas Sankara Speaks, he actually defended that policy by pointing out that Burkina Faso is the type of country where historically strikes have made, or his words were actually strikes make or break governments in Burkina Faso. So he recognized that he needed to get on top of the strike and shut down the strike as quickly as possible because the strike could get out of hand and cause further problems for his country. So he definitely was dealing with those problems of how do you address the needs of the people, but also trying to protect the revolutionary government. And I mean, it's not just him that had that problem. I mentioned before about Marxist-Leninist governments, revolutionary governments. Many of them deal with the problem of rhetorically they're speaking in the interest of the masses and trying to address the needs of the masses while also being very much aware that there are counter-revolutionary forces both internally and externally. A classic example of that would be Cuba. For many decades Fidel Castro was in power, the United States kept continuously trying to overthrow his government, and that created a situation where, for the protection of the revolutionary government in Cuba, Castro implemented very repressive policies, restricted freedom of speech. I mentioned Maurice Bishop. Bishop's same problem in Grenada as well. Under Bishop's government, there was very repressive policies, repression of freedom of speech. People were jailed arbitrarily in Grenada. You could just be jailed without any type of cause. So Sankara was another example of a government trying to deal with those problems of being sympathetic towards the needs of the masses and the need, sometimes that being the masses needing to express their grievances with a particular government, but also having to try to protect the same government from counter-revolutionary forces as well. So, as I mentioned, that is something that Thomas Sankara has been criticized for being very autocratic. And I just think he was in a very difficult situation where there weren't necessarily easy answers. But I would argue that ironically, even though he's criticized for being autocratic, had he had been more autocratic, he probably would have been alive. He probably wouldn't have been overthrown in the coup, because there was a documentary, Thomas Sankara, Upright Man, that I believe is still available on YouTube. But in that documentary, one of the people who was interviewed made the point that Thomas Sankara was warned that Blaise Compaoré, the man who led the coup to overthrow him, Sankara was warned that there was Compaoré was plotting against him. But Sankara's mentality was, well, Blaise Compaoré is my friend, and I'm not going to betray the friendship. If anyone's going to betray the friendship, let him do it first. So he was aware that there was something happening against him in the government, and had he been more oppressive, more authoritarian, more autocratic, he probably would have been the type of leader who stepped in and purged the government and imprisoned and executed anyone that he believed was involved in that. But Thomas Sankara wasn't willing to take those precautions to keep himself
right. And unfortunately, if I remember correctly, this is supposedly his best friend.
His best friend, yeah. Actually, they were so close. I believe Sankara actually introduced Blaise Compaoré to his wife. So yeah, a very, very close friendship.
Yes. So that brings me to this question: why and how did the revolution end?
Well, I mean, I addressed part of it. Part of it was that there were counter-revolutionary elements within the government that Thomas Sankara, for many different reasons, decided not to address. And I think part of it is he may not have understood the extent to which the counter-revolutionary forces were working against him. But the other thing too with Sankara, he was very fatalistic in a sense. And once again, I'll reference that same book, Thomas Sankara Speaks. He mentioned in that book that his view of his view of the end of his life would either be as an old man in a library reading books, are not even living to old age. So he's very realistic about the fact that the positions he was taking would likely result in him being assassinated. And he mentioned this in the final in the speech he gave to the same institution I mentioned earlier, the OAU. That was on one of his final speeches in '87. He mentioned how he's going to refuse to pay the debt to the Western powers, and that if other African nations didn't join him in doing so, he might not make the next conference. And he was correct; he didn't live to see the next conference. So I think part of part of the problem as well with Sankara, he seemed to have accepted that the course of what he was doing was going to lead to assassination. So perhaps that's also a factor into why he didn't take more why he didn't take stricter measures or precautions to protect his government. But I think apart from Thomas Sankara's personal decisions or actions regarding what he should have done or what he could have done to protect himself from being overthrown, I think on a more broader scale, when we're thinking about why the revolution ended the way that it did, I think some of it was institutional as well, because I mentioned Sankara came to power in a military coup, and his government always was a military government. It wasn't he never transitioned to civilian government, and that's why every time you see a picture of Sankara publicly, he's always wearing military fatigues. The ministers and the government dressed the same way. It was a military government, and I think unfortunately, one of the setbacks of structuring the government in that way is that when the coup happened and the military took power, the military was already an aspect of the government anyways. The military held control over the government. So it was essentially transferring the government from one section of the military control to another section of military control. The civilians were left out of that process. So even though Sankara's government was interested in the conditions of his people and addressing the particular issues that civilians faced, it was not a civilian government. And I think that structure made it much easier for the military to seize power and to push the civilians out of any type of say or influence in the direction of the government moving forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, what can we do today to continue the revolution?
Well, Burkina Faso is actually very interesting, topic when we talk about continuing the revolution, because I'll give a little personal story that I've been a Pan-Africanist for several years, but 2014 was really the year that crystallized in my mind the need for Pan-Africanism. What was significant about that year for me was that was the year that there was an uprising in Burkina Faso that finally overthrew Blaise Compaoré.
Right.
That same year also saw massive protest in Haiti as well against the president there. And that year was also the same year that there were uprisings in Ferguson. So I'm already Pan-Africanist at the time, but I'm watching all these different rebellions and uprisings take place across the African world. And that sent the message to me that we really need a Pan-African movement, because everywhere that you look at African people globally, we're resisting, we're struggling, but there seems to be a lack of organization, both on a local level wherever you see these struggles, but also on an international level as well. Because when Thomas Sankara was in power in the 1980s, there was still some semblance of an international Pan-African movement. So I mentioned he had met with Maurice Bishop in Grenada. Thomas Sankara was also very close to Samori Michel from Mozambique. So during this time period, there was still an international Pan-African movement where these leaders were building with each other and supporting each other's struggles. So in 2014, when I saw these revolutions and these uprisings taking place across the African world, I just had a sense that African people are fighting globally wherever we are, and we need to find a way to connect these different struggles. So I think in terms of continuing the revolution, continuing Thomas Sankara's legacy, one of the most important things that we can do is to really be engaged in these struggles that are taking place, and also to start building the type of international connections that we had in the Pan-African movement in the past, and that I feel we could definitely use again today. Because in 2014, one of the things that I was slowly starting to recognize when I realized that there was not much of an international connection among these movements was that Pan-Africanists ourselves, or people who call themselves Pan-Africanists, because I feel like a lot of people who call themselves Pan-Africanists really don't understand what that should entail. I feel like we need to do a better job at building those international connections. And I always make the point that I don't think as a Pan-Africanist our job is necessarily to lead, and I shouldn't say lead, necessarily to initiate or start these rebellions, because in many situations they happen spontaneously anyways, because our people know that they're oppressed. So the job isn't necessarily to tell Black people that they're oppressed or to tell them that there's a need to rebel. I think that happens just as a product of being having to deal with the conditions that our people are dealing with. So I think what Pan-Africanists need to do, and Kwame Ture made this point about the job of the conscious is to make the unconscious conscious of their struggle. So I think many of our people are struggling on an unconscious level, and those of us who are conscious Pan-Africanists need to instill a level of conscious struggle. And that conscious struggle not only entails, organization and everything that goes with building an organization, but it also entails understanding the importance of building these international connections. And another point I will make on this is the U.S. South Africa summit that we saw happen recently. And for years, I've always been an advocate for pointing out that these summits, whenever the United States has these meetings with African countries and provides aid to these countries, it's not isolated from the conditions of Black people in the United States. And what I mean by this is that the U.S. government could give millions of dollars in aid to prop up dictatorships in Togo or wherever else in Africa, and in doing so, they're upholding neocolonialism. But the other aspect of what they're doing is resources that are being taken from Black Americans that could be put back into Black American communities are being sent overseas to oppress African people on the continent by propping up these dictators. So it's a situation where Black Americans are being taxed to not only uphold their own oppression on a domestic level, but also being taxed so that their tax funds could go to financing dictatorial and oppressive governments such as the one in Togo.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think we've had a great conversation regarding the legacy and, of course, revolutionary administration of one Thomas Sankara. So I'm going to put the link in the chat for everyone who's watching. If you want to tap in and share your perspective on Thomas Sankara, you're watching Lumumba Speaks, and we're looking to honor the life and legacy of Africa's Che Guevara, Thomas Sankara. We do know that the speech he gave a week before he was assassinated, he actually was honoring one Che Guevara, stated that although you could kill revolutionaries, you can't kill a revolution, you cannot kill ideas. So the link is in the chat, brothers and sisters. If you want to tap in, share your perspective of what you've learned from today, and of course your view of the late great Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara, born on this day. Sankara born on this day 73 years ago, December 21st, 1949, in what was then known as Upper Volta, now known as Burkino Faso. So you mentioned, so before we get some people to tap in, you mentioned that you've written 23 books. So that is extremely impressive. I don't care who you are. You're like the Pan-Africanist Michael Eric Dyson, if you ask me, right?
That's not the first time I've heard that.
Okay. But with that being said, do you self-publish? Do you have your own publishing company?
Self-published, yeah.
Okay, could you share with everyone the name of your publishing company if they want to go out and support?
Oh, it's not published. Amazon. Amazon has a free self-publishing platform. But what I can say about self-publishing is that I had an experience recently where I was actually in a publishing company reached out to me to publish a work in a book that was released recently, Dreams of Wakanda, based on the Black Panther.
Okay.
Why I'm mentioning this is this experience reinforced the fact that to me, self-publishing is more aligned with the work I feel like I should be doing for African people, because they reached out to me and I wrote my contribution to that book, and I touched on the impact of colonialism in Africa and how Wakanda is a fictional representation of what Africa might have been able to look like had Africa not been colonized. Right. So in the book, I point out that a lot of Western countries took resources from Africa, and that helped to build, Western companies and Western industries. And I mentioned De Beers, the diamond company.
Right. Firestone Tire. Yeah.
Well, I mentioned De Beers, but there's a reason why I'm bringing up specifically. And apparently I shouldn't have done this, because the book was published by Penguin Random House in collaboration with Marvel and with Disney, who owns Marvel. So I submit the final draft of my chapter in the book, and I get an email back saying everything is fine, except they had to remove the reference to De Beers because Disney has a partnership with De Beers, so they can't have me publishing material that's critical of their partner in a book
Wow.
that Disney sponsors. So I'm self-published, and that's one of the reasons why, because when you deal with a publisher, they tend to try to dictate how the tone of what you're writing, what you should write, what can be in there, what can't be in there. So I take full advantage of the fact that in this age of technology, it's very easy to self-publish a book. So all my material is
Understood. Understood. So I'm gonna have to get with you on that, definitely. So we need to work together, and
Yeah.
we're gonna talk offline when this is over with.
Yeah, I got you.
So tap in, brothers and sisters. We're honoring the legacy of Africa's Che Guevara, Thomas Sankara. Today is his 73rd birthday. He's gone but not forgotten. We know his spirit lives on. And the question we have for everyone in the audience, tap in and be part of the conversation, is what can we do today to continue the African Revolution? So, Sister Michelle is tapping in. Appreciate you, sister. How are you doing this evening?
Thank you. Good evening, panel. Good morning. Good evening, Mr. Dwayne. I appreciate your insight into our great leaders' history.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. And also, Brother Lumba, for honoring him on your show. It's so important that we honor our heroes.
Now, you said the next time you tapped in, you was going to cam up. So come on.
Yeah, but see, you be doing it after 8 o'clock, after 9 o'clock. You need to do daytime hours. You know, after 8 o'clock, it's bonnet time.
Okay, got you. Yeah, we don't want to do the bonnet crew. Okay, I got you.
Yeah, you have to do a midday show.
Oh, wait, but so here's the issue. Most people are working midday.
Oh, okay.
Right? So, we want to
that is the issue. But on a Saturday, like a nice Saturday afternoon.
I got you. Okay, we'll make something happen. We can make something happen. We will work together to make something happen, definitely.
Yeah, so but the question is Burkina Faso's current status today. They're trying to the financial problems. France interference.
Yes, ma'am.
Our leader Thomas Sankara saw all this as an issue and tried to avert all this, but we're still back at square one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, unfortunately that's the case, and Burkina Faso's situation, we're really back at square one, because the point I didn't mention earlier, there was a lot of political instability in Burkina Faso before Thomas Sankara took power. He was not the first coup in the country's history, and unfortunately, since Blaise Compaoré has been overthrown, the nation has experienced a lot of political instability, a lot of coups as well, a lot of problems with France, because France and other Western powers are still trying to create that control over Burkina Faso. So they had another coup recently, and this new government seems to be very anti-French, and there's a lot of anti-French sentiments in the country right now, and that actually is influencing the international perception of Burkina Faso, to the point where Burkina Faso was one of the African nations that was not invited to the summit that was held recently, precisely because of the anti-French sentiments coming from the government there.
Doesn't that give segue for China to come in?
Yeah, I mean, well, Burkina Faso, I'm sure China will try to make an attempt to step in, but it seems like right now Russia seems to be the big influence in Burkina Faso. So they're overthrowing French rule, but they're also leaning towards the Russian power as well. And that I mean, China is also a big player in Africa right now in terms of influence. So part of what's motivating the recent summit that I mentioned with the United States is trying to counterbalance Russia and China's influence on the continent. But in Burkina Faso situation, there seems to be more of a Russian influence than a Chinese influence.
Another thing you mentioned that I find very hurtful is Harlem's being gentrified, because Harlem could have been like a black capital for us in the Western Hemisphere. Because I visited I visited on a school trip, I think in 1999. A teacher took us to visit Black Harlem, and we visited various sites, the open markets, the various homes. And a few years later, when I ran into that teacher who took us, he was like, that era starting to get, gentrification. That's when I started really hearing that buzzword.
Mm-hmm.
Because we were talking about how I never knew Harlem was such an impactful city. And that's when he shared how about gentrification. And that's when I really started hearing that in my lexicon. That was about 5-6 years ago, because I ran into that particular teacher, and how it's important for teachers to teach children about their history. Having a teacher that loves your students enough to teach them about their history, to take them to Harlem. So, it- so my question: are we, based on what we're talking about, Thomas Sankara, the legacy he left when he came to the Western Hemisphere? How are we going to continue it as a people? Because I just feel we're slowly erasing ourselves.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate problem. It's not just Harlem. I came back from DC a few weeks ago, and when I was there, I saw firsthand the gentrification taking place in Chocolate City. So that's a very
Very aggressive. Very
yeah,
aggressive. You have the mayor. Yeah, I don't want to take the show off topic.
yeah. So it's a very serious problem. But to answer your question, that also reinforces the need to continue Thomas Sankara's legacy. And we spoke before about self-reliance, self-determination. Part of the problem with gentrification is that the people who live in those communities don't have control over their communities. So it's very easy for people who actually have power and control to step into the community and push the people out. So that just demonstrates the need to really start organizing our people towards collective economic and political empowerment, so that we don't have these problems with gentrification. Because I mean, it's a national issue. It's a problem in Harlem. As I mentioned, coming back from DC, I saw firsthand how bad gentrification is there. Even locally where I live, a lot of the Black communities are being gentrified here. I live in Central Florida, so there was a situation not too long ago where the Orlando Magic built a new arena and essentially pushed all of the Black businesses out of that area. So nationally, we're seeing this problem of gentrification, and I think it stems from the fact that we live in these communities, but we don't actually have any sort of power or control over the communities in which we live in. And that was Thomas Sankara's one of the main points that he stressed as a Pan-African revolutionary: the need to have power and control over your destiny.
Absolutely. Brother Jabril says Thomas Sankara was greater than Che Guevara. It is awful that we say he was an African version of him. It's disrespectful to his legacy. Ashe and Black Power, brother. Tap in and please, we can unpack that statement. As I stated before here, Lumumba Speaks, we believe in Black empowerment, and I am not beyond reproach. Okay, so we could come up with a better title for the late, great Thomas Sankara. So I hope you could tap in. The link is in the chat. Sister Michelle, go right ahead.
And so, to me, that takes to the greater extent of what Pan-Africanism is our self-preservation. So when are we going to have a talk about our self-preservation as a people? Now that we're seeing this aggressive removal, a lot of lights are going off in people now. Now they're trying to revert to the Malcolm X's, the Martin Luther King, and ask what happened, because right now we're being removed.
Right.
And again, back to the topic of the day, Thomas Sankara foresaw this for his people, because Burkina Faso hasn't been right since he's left.
Right.
This is true. Yes. Absolutely.
And the concern I have of my people is, including myself, we need an aggressive education that understand we are here only for a moment in time, and our purpose here is to make a positive mark and ensure it's in our continuum as a people. And we as a people don't get it. Everybody's looking at their self-interest. You seeing it like I don't want to take us too off the subject. Thomas Sankara's best friend killed him. This is somebody you broke bread with. So somebody from outside could convince you to kill him? Is it that much jealousy? You could even spare your man's life? I mean, so when you really look at it, you see the psychological effects of our people, that you want to kill your own brother because some outsider somehow convinced you. That bond somebody from outside can easily break. That's all I have to say on that, because that really hurts me that his friend conspired to kill him and had no mercy or to even give him grace.
Yeah, and that's an unfortunate reality when we talk about great historical African leaders. That is an unfortunate reality. We could look at Patrice Lumumba. The same thing. He wasn't necessarily killed by his best friend, but there were forces that were working with the colonial agents to overthrow and kill him. Malcolm X as well. There were people in the Nation of Islam that really wanted Malcolm X killed. So we definitely do have a problem within the community of certain leaders facing opposition from people within the community itself.
Absolutely, and not having any loyalty. And I think we can almost extrapolate on that. And we're going to do actually a show on the assassination of Malcolm X. And of course, we're going to lean on your expertise.
But
I've
heard a lot about that.
Yes, I mean, so we hear the rhetoric from the nation. I can recall I was giving a talk with a youth group. There was a brother there who was a member of the nation, and he basically stated, "Well, none of us was there, so we shouldn't speak on what took place." And I said, "Malarkey, right?" I said, "Listen, if that is your logic, you can never show." I said, "If that is your logic, you can never serve on a jury."
But,
okay.
But here's my thing: if that's the logic, what can you speak on them? Because I mean, that wipes out the vast majority of any historical topic. Because if you weren't there, but even contemporary issues, if you weren't there for a political, let's say it's a political, issue taking place, if you weren't there in Congress, if you weren't there in the White House, you can't speak to it. So what is the logic behind that? That can't speak to it?
And some of it was trying to save face, doing some damage control. But I said, listen, I'm a reasonable guy. Right, I try not to be dogmatic. Right, keyword is try. Right, I've gotten better than how I was in undergrad. But I said, here's the biggest issue. I said, I'm a reasonable guy. I said, in Pan-Africanist circles and Black nationalist circles and circles in which people are truly vested in helping restore our people's traditional greatness, you all can receive, for lack of better words, several kudos for just admitting we did this, we were wrong, we regret it. How can we make amends? Right, but to still try to create a nebulous dark cloud as we don't really know what happened. We know Farrakhan many years ago, back in the 80s, gave a big speech at a local Chicago high school and said what really happened. And then the entire speech, he never even addressed the issue of what transpired. Right, so I mean, this type of tomfoolery and double talk, I think, does more harm to the organization. And we don't want to have a referendum on the Nation of Islam. That's a topic for another day. But I also want to speak to the fact that it's unfortunate, as you said before, that we always tend to have our people fall at the hands of our own kind. And then, of course, the white power structure can at least wash their hands up and say, well, they did it to themselves, so you can't blame us.
Yeah, and I mean, I mentioned Lumumba, Malcolm X as an example. I mentioned again earlier, Walter Ronnie is another prominent example of that. That unfortunately, at the time, the government that assassinated him was an African-led government, but it's even deeper because Walter Ronnie tried to return to Ghana just to teach at the university, and the government essentially barred him from being able to teach in the country. So we could go down the list of great African revolutionary leaders who received opposition and were even killed by other African people. And as you said, typically that creates a situation where the white power structure could step back and say, well, we had nothing to do with it. It was another African, another Black American, another Guyanese, or whoever it was that killed this leader. But obviously we know that there's forces that instigate a lot of these divisions, the Nation of Islam being a very typical example. And what's really fascinating about the Nation of Islam is that Malcolm X knew that it was infiltrated. He mentioned the infiltration in the Nation of Islam. In his autobiography, he even mentions talking to brothers who were sent to infiltrate the Nation of Islam and converting them and having them join the organization.
Right.
So I mean, even at the time period, it was very well known that there were certain forces that were acting against the interest of Malcolm and the interest of the Nation of Islam. And I even mentioned before Thomas Sankara was killed, he was made aware that there were people in the government that were trying to kill him as well. So it wasn't like he was unaware. And as I mentioned before, I think the particular problem with that is that Sankara wasn't the type of person who was going to act out in a way where he was going to do anything to someone who he considered a friend. So it's almost like he was essentially waiting for the counter-revolution to happen against him because he wasn't going to take action against his friend.
Absolutely. I think one of the major issues, and Sister Mary says that's why it's best to just be alone. Do we really have fans? But then the question is, how much can you truly achieve as a lone wolf?
Yeah,
right?
that's
So. I mean, I think I forget the poet or writer that stated, "No man is an island," right? So unless you're Reeves Island, right? And we're talking football now. I don't think that is something that could truly be a reality, particularly if you're trying to get any type of work done anywhere throughout the African world.
Yeah, it'd be difficult.
But my question to you is,
go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Dwayne. My question is, historically, many ancient African kingdom was built on our collective understanding and cooperation with each other. That's why we have the great kingdoms, our great inventions, our art, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So my next question to you, whatever became of Thomas Sankora's family, if you know?
I do know, actually. He has two sons. Last I heard, they live in Washington, D.C. So I haven't met the family personally, but I know someone who actually does know the family personally, and I was made aware that they're living in D.C.
Okay. Oh, okay. So he has a living legacy, and this is very important because one of the ways they may kill me physically, but another way they try to kill a person is through their lineage. So I was just curious.
Yeah. So last I heard, they were living in D.C. So he has two sons. His wife is still alive as well.
Yes, she is. Yes,
she's very vocal on certain developments that have been taking place in Burkina Faso as well.
Absolutely. So the question we're asking, brothers and sisters, as we honor the legacy of Thomas Sankara, is what can we do today to continue the revolution of African people, i.e., restoring our people to traditional greatness. We know one of the greatest quotes Thomas Sankara gave was, "Never be ashamed to be African." That is something I believe in. That probably is going to be my next tattoo, to be quite honest with you. I'm in need of some ink therapy, right? So I might I'll get a picture of Thomas Sankara with the quote, "Never ashamed to be African." I'm running out of room on my body, but I'm going to find a place. So tap in, brothers and sisters. I'm going to put the link in the chat once again. The link should be in the description. If not, you can let me know. And the question is, what can we do today to continue the revolution of African people? So I think go right ahead, sister.
I think this shows as a great continuance of Thomas Sankora's legacy. Us here fellowshipping, remembering him, giving him our, spiritual libations, continuing his legacy as part of the African diaspora collective. I just hope one day this forum that you've created can become mega. So now we will have institutions.
Yes,
we can. Therefore I have to be physically present.
Yes. And I would say this when we talk about how can we continue the revolution. I was a huge fan of Thomas Sankara's pioneer movement, so much so that when I was part of the Coalition of African Unity, which was a Pan-African organization in Dayton, Ohio, we had a youth wing of the CAU known as the Pioneer Movement. And my son and daughter were the preeminent children involved in the pioneer movement. Of course, they didn't have a choice in the matter, but at least when they took the pictures, they seemed to be very happy. And so I believe that one of the things that I've done to continue the revolution, of course, in the spirit of Thomas Sankara and all of the late and great Pan-Africanist leaders of that great line of divine that rims from, of course, Paul Kufi, who was the first to repatriate, all the way to today, is believing in the youth, right? And pouring into the youth and advocating at a very early age that they have a clear sense of who they are and, of course, what they are up against in a world that I think we can all agree is vehemently anti-African, anti-Black. So once again, brothers and sisters, the link is in the chat if you want to tap in, be part of the conversation. You can share with us what you knew about Thomas Sankara before, what you've learned during, of course, the great information that was shared by Brother Dwayne. Also, Brother Dwayne, if you could give people your contact information, they want to get a hold of you, your YouTube, your Twitter, so on and so forth. You can put that in the chat. You can also verbalize that as well.
Yeah, I'll put that in the chat.
Okay, very good, very good. So, Sister Michelle, I will pose a question to you. In your everyday life, what do you think that you can do to continue the revolution?
Continue to work with my community. I work in a environment mainly Black people. Working with continue to support them within my areas of constraint. Again, like Brother Dwayne mentioned, we're being aggressively gentrified, so therefore we're seeing a lot of attacks. And attacks means like sudden increase in your rent. You try to call the foreman to come fix something. You almost have to call Channel 7 before you can get some help. Taxes are starting to rise up. Again, you come outside, somebody's asking you to sell your house. Your landlord's giving you problems. There's a food store that no longer provides the type of food you're used to eating in terms of like collard greens. So now they're selling some other type of vegetables. Not necessarily you need to explore, but that's not what culturally who you are. The chronic illnesses my community had, mental illness among Black men is so severe. And I'm noticing a connection. If the family doesn't own property, the severity of mental illness, substance use become more prone.
True.
If there's no family like ownership of some type of property. So you're more prone to homelessness. Yeah, just even me seeing like my job the other day, you see somebody, approaching you, asking you about the property. And I'm like, look, lady, I just work here. You ask me who owns, because I guess they're trying to find out who's what's what so they can come in there. You see the invasion happening. It's not with guns and knives maybe 200-300 years ago. It's done silently, it's done smoothly.
Right. Fortunately, yeah. Understood. So would you state that part of the focus has to be on ownership?
Yeah, ownership and also continuation of it. Reason why I think we've lost a lot of property as Black people is because we fail to see the value of relationships, family, reverence. Like for example, once people get a little bit of change, they want to move outside. They're looking to move to Atlanta. They're looking to move to California or wherever. So therefore, who's going to take over the property?
Right.
And nowadays, you need 2 incomes to manage your home. So yes, you may have cousins such as us who's 20-something years old, but they really can't maintain the property because guess what? They're in their mid-20s. They really don't have enough resources to maintain the house because the property taxes are high. So it's just better to sell it, everybody get their cut, and start their new lives, and the family lineage is disconnected.
Right.
Where if we were given real loans, what we probably could have done was knock down that house, rebuild it so everybody can have a unit, and so we can maintain the property within the family. But again, these are so systematic and so convoluted and complicated because we don't see each other as a collective, like Thomas and Cora wanted us to see ourselves. So now other people are coming in and just destroying us one by one, because we bought into individualism.
Right.
And it's not working out.
It's not working out. Absolutely. And you're in the DMV, yes?
Yes.
Okay, got you. Okay.
Yeah, because what happened is that because you got some, this is a transit like government contractors. So a lot of what's happening now, what they're doing is you could turn, if you're close, as long as you're closer to, you're in DC or closer to the district, they can rent like a house to like traveling nurses, contractors for like a couple of months and charge astronomical fees. So they don't even want people with Section 8. Why would I want to take somebody on Section 8 when I can just call like a travel agency and say, hey, look, I got rooms for rent. They pay you gums of money up front so you can just house their people. And they're not, and guess what? Because they're working, they're not going to damage your property and call a whole bunch of times because they need things fixed.
Right.
Because this is a government town, so people are just coming in and out. So they need housing, and it's cheaper for them to rent a place than put you in a hotel.
Understood.
So and because we are not educated on our history as a people, like again, it was teachers who decided not to go against the curriculum, like I shared earlier, to take us to Harlem, for us to see Harlem, the history of Harlem, and teach us about other things about Black history. That's why I'm even here today on your show, because a teacher thought of us enough to make sure we got our education. That's why I say the importance of Black teachers.
Right.
Even just a little sprinkle could change a child's life.
Absolutely. And Brother Millionaire Maine states, never learned anything about Thomas Sankara until discovering my DNA goes back to the Mosi of Burkina Faso. Sankara accomplished so much in a short span of time. Salute to him. Absolutely. I'm going to put the link in the chat. Once again, we're having a conversation where we are honoring the legacy of Thomas Sankara while also posing the question, what can we do today to continue the revolution that Sankara started? And of course, we can make the argument that Sankara didn't start the argument. The revolution started when the first Africans refused, of course, to go down without fighting, for lack of better words, during the advent of the mob for the African Holocaust of colonialism, imperialism, racism, and slavery. So the link is in the chat. We're posing the question, what can we do today to continue the revolution as we honor the life, legacy, and 73rd birthday of Thomas Sankara, the 5th president of Burkina Faso? And I would be remiss in my duty if I do not state that Burkina Faso means land of the upright people. Thomas Sankara changed the name of the country from Opal to Burkina Faso. And the capital, of course, is Ouagadougou. If you do not know about Burkina Faso is a landlocked country in West Central Africa. So the link is in the chat. Once again, Brother Dwayne, if you wanted to share with us your contact information, how people could get a hold to you, that would be greatly appreciated.
Oh yeah, I believe I put them in the chat actually. My the link to my Twitter and Facebook pages.
Okay, I didn't see it, so yeah, I don't see it at all.
But I did.
Then also, I remember briefly this brother called JT Figure was buying property in Burkina Faso. Then a gentleman with mental illness came and got ambushed. Are you familiar with it? I'll have to go on YouTube. And...
No, I'm not.
Familiar. Okay. Not familiar with that either, but would not be surprised, because one of the problems with African governments is they do tend to just give away land and property to whoever without necessarily vetting who it's going to.
And why do you think that is the case?
So, Walter Ronnie actually had a great lecture on this after Jonestown happened in Guyana. And for those who aren't familiar with that history, Jim Jones was essentially a cult leader in the United States who managed to acquire land in Guyana and built a settlement for himself and his followers, and ultimately ended in a massive, murder-suicide type situation where about 900 of his followers were forced to ingest poison, killing them, and then he killed himself after the fact. So Walter Ronnie gave a lecture discussing how it is that an event like this could have taken place. And the point that he made was that because of the history of colonialism and the relationship that African and Caribbean countries have to Western powers, he said it created a situation where any con man from Europe or from the United States could go to an African or Caribbean country, sell themselves to the people there, and the people there will believe it simply because it's a white person telling them this. So it's that psychological conditioning of, I'll accept anything that a white man tells me because it's the white man who's telling it to me.
Right. And we see that even in the religious communities. Right, oftentimes these individuals come through, the snake oil salesmen. Right, we could even talk about the mythological origins of the Nation of Islam. Right, where they come in and they're selling prayer cloths and holy water. Before you know it, they own damn near half of the whole town. Right, so I think this is something unfortunate that we have to be aware of. And I think what tends to happen is we unfortunately have a psychological disposition to accept this type of colorful speech from charismatic individuals. I think part of that comes from the sense of helplessness that many of our people have due to living under the conditions that they're living under.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And I mean, unfortunately, the easiest victim for a con artist, particularly the type of con artists we're talking about that come with a particular type of rhetoric, is people who are vulnerable. So a lot of these people exploit the Black community because they know this is a vulnerable community, it's a struggling community that's looking for anything that's going to give them hope or make them feel better about their condition. So we have a lot of people in the community who know how to tell the community and tell people what it is that they want to hear.
Right.
And then that becomes the basis of the con. And I mean, Nation of Islam was one of those organizations. And I mean, to the Nation of Islam's benefit, it did build institutions that did benefit its members materially. So it wasn't just merely rhetoric, but a lot of what the Nation of Islam was doing was built on the fact that it was addressing a population who was more or less hopeless and needing something to gravitate to and to feel better and to raise the self-esteem and the consciousness of the people. So that is also an aspect as well as to why African people seem to be so susceptible to con artists and religious leaders who exploit the masses of people, and even politicians. You mentioned earlier about politicians making promises. A lot of times people fall for those tricks because politicians also know how to tell the people what it is that they want to hear.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also they know, oftentimes, politicians, they have a team around them that tells them what to say, how to say it, what mannerisms to use, right, to get the masses to trust them. And as we know, particularly not only in America, but I can argue almost across the world, particularly in so-called democracies, most candidates are selected before they are elected. And they're selected by the oligarchs and the plutocrats that run the world.
Brother Dwayne, I have a question about France. What's going on with France? Because France is just having a hissy fit with Africa right now. It appears.
Well, what's going on is, and this has been an ongoing issue, for a while, a lot of African countries, there's a lot of rebellions and uprisings taking place right now in Africa. The reason why I've mentioned Togo so frequently is because I have, direct connection to supporting the uprising taking place there. And Togo is a nation which, for the last 5 decades, has been run by a military dictatorship supported by France. So what's happening in a lot of African countries is African people are rising up. And I mentioned Burkino Faso as a situation where, not too long ago, there was a revolution that overthrew the government there. So people on the continent are rising up. They're fighting against these neo-colonial dictatorships. And in overthrowing or fighting against these dictatorships, they're also fighting against the French influence in Africa. So Togo, when I became involved in the revolutionary struggle in Togo, I became connected to a movement called Four Must Go. Now, what's interesting about Four Must Go is you'll notice that it's in English, but Togo is a French-speaking country.
Go right ahead, I'm sorry.
The reason why the movement was named in English is because the people who founded that movement want to send a message that they're not just kicking Four out of Togo, they're kicking the French out as well. So that's why they deliberately created a slogan that was in English rather than French. So what's happening with France and Africa is, as African people are, having these rebellions and these uprisings and fighting against the dictatorships, they're realizing that not only do they have to fight against the local dictatorships, but they also have to fight against the French influence that's propping up these leaders. So France is really struggling right now to, maintain its control and its hold over its former African colonies. And I think even some of these African dictators are recognizing that France may not have the influence that it used to have moving forward. And the reason why I state this is because Togo recently joined the Commonwealth. Now, Togo is not a former British colony. As I said, it's a French-speaking country. Now, why would a French-speaking country join the British Commonwealth? And I think part of it is because Togo is probably looking at everything that's taking place with French colonialism in Africa and realizing that maybe moving forward in the future, French imperialism cannot sustain these dictatorships as it has done in the past. So, at least in the Togo situation, it seems like that government is looking outside of France to find its international support. But, to answer your question, what's happening with France and Africa is that Africans are fighting the French influence, and France is obviously not very happy about that.
Right.
And one more thing, I noticed Tunisia, I believe, said they no longer want French as a national language. They prefer to learn English. And to support your point, English is an international language.
Yep.
I have a colleague who's from Cameroon. I think they're on the French-speaking side, and she encourages her family that are there to learn English. Don't waste your time with French. In so many words.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is financial because English being an international language, English is the language spoken or used by a lot of countries that have a very large influence in the global marketplace. So I know a lot of people in non-English speaking countries try to learn English just to be competitive in the global marketplace. But the other aspect of it as well, in terms of the African context, is France keeps its countries very isolated from the rest of Africa. So one of the ways it does this is the CFA franc currency that it has that can't be spent outside of the French colonies. So part of the isolation as well is having a population of people who speak French but don't speak English and therefore can't communicate to brothers and sisters who do speak English. And Togo offers another example of how this language barrier does create a very real division among African people. So one of the things I learned over the course of my work with Togo is that Ghana is right next door to Togo, and a lot of Ghanaians really don't know much about Togo's politics. For example, I've met Ghanaians, and I've heard that this was very common among Ghanaians, and I personally met people who have this view that reinforced what I've been hearing. I've met Ghanaians who, when they talk about the president of Togo, they're thinking Ayedema Nesingbe is the president of Togo. That's the father of the current president. Ayedema died in, I believe, 2005. So he's been dead for several years now, but there's people in Ghana who think he's still the president of Togo, even though he's been dead for more than a decade. And that just demonstrates the fact that the language barrier creates a very real barrier to information, to the point where people living right next to Togo don't necessarily know what's going on with the politics there. So I think part of what's driving the need or the desire by some people in French-speaking countries to learn English is not only the fact that English is a more international language than French, and it makes you more competitive in the global marketplace to know English, but I think part of it too is that feeling of isolation that speaking French has, where I think a lot of French-speaking African countries are starting to realize that they're isolated from the English-speaking countries due to that language barrier. And that was a very deliberate policy by French. To go back to Togo one more time, Sylvanus Olympio, the first president of Togo, made the point that the French colonial structure in Togo was such that it was easier, when he took power from the French in Togo, it was easier for him to send communications to France than it was for him to send communications to neighboring Ghana or even to Nigeria. So imagine that the colonial structure was such that it's easier for you to send a message or relay a message all the way to France than it is for you to relay a message to the country that you're right next door to. So these languages and the way that the colonial structure was set up was very deliberately done to isolate African people from each other and make the flow of information very difficult.
Absolutely. And Brother Bag 764 states asked the question: what's your opinion on the new leader in Burkina Faso? So we know that there was a coup back in I think at the end of September of this year.
Yeah.
And there was alleged, particularly by the Ghanaian government, that the new president, when he came into the capital, Ouagadougou, there were some people were waving Russian flags.
Yeah.
It's been alleged that he's working with a Russian mercenary group, company called Wagner Group. Brother Dwayne, do you have any insight on that?
My position at the moment is a wait and see type of position, because I think, especially what happens with a coup, we tend to jump to conclusions, try to come up with rationalizations for why the coup happened and that sort of thing. So my position at the moment for Burkina Faso is just waiting to see what happens with this new government, especially given the political instability that's been taking place in Burkina Faso. I wouldn't be surprised if within a year or two we might be seeing another coup. So my position on Burkina Faso is, and it's the same thing in Guinea as well. Guinea, you had a coup not too long before Burkina Faso. So in any situation where an African country has undergone a coup, my approach is to just wait and see how it plays out, because we don't know all of the information necessarily. But
absolutely.
But what
And,
I will say is
go right
sorry to
ahead.
cut you off, but what I will say though is it is very concerning, because the coup took place in the context of a growing threat of Islamic extremism,
Right, jihad.
also, and a lot of other West African countries. So not only are we talking about political instability, but we're also talking about an increase in violent religious extremism in many African nations, and that also is a very
A
serious
cause for concern, because we know the history there.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. So Millionaire Mainstays, as far as JT, that Sister Michelle was talking about, he did a lot there, built water wells, helped the artist community, and he did buy some land, which people still own. Mary Shaw says, Millionaire, yes, I used to watch JT Big Figure, but I stopped watching him. So Sister Shaw, you can share with us why you stopped watching him. Brother Shabazz says, when I started learning French, I realized that there was an entirely different world in French is. I took 2 years of French in undergrad, très difficile, right? I was always studying at the bibliothèque, which of course means French for library, right?
Yeah.
And so many people may be unaware, but English does have some French loan words, such as fiancé, mansion, bibliophile. These are all words of French origin. And so, of course, we know that comes due to the historic relationship between the French people and, of course, English people when they would cross the English Channel several years ago. But with that being said, I think it's rather interesting that as I think Sister Michelle and Brother Dwayne elucidated to earlier on the broadcast, that since Sankara, of course, was removed from office, unfortunately in a bloody manner in which he lost his life, Burkina Faso has continued to have disruptions in terms of the society, stability, economic development, of course, so on and so forth. So I think this is definitely an issue. But the question we're asking while we're honoring, of course, the life and legacy of I'm sorry, not Africa Che Guevara, but Thomas Sankara. I'm going to go back and edit that so it's not on the title tag. But also the 73rd birthday of Thomas Sankara. One of my teachers, Pan-Africanist teachers, who was of course, an acolyte and a student of one John Henry Clark, was born in 1949 as well, and he's 73 years old. So it just shows you that this is all taking place in a relatively short amount of time. But we're also asking the question, what can we do to continue the revolution? So tap in. I'm going to put the link in the chat one more time. The link should also be in the description. I want you to tap in and share what are you doing today to continue the revolution to help restore African people to our traditional greatness. You're watching Lumumba Speaks here on YouTube. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. Make sure you hit the notification bell as well.
Yes. Saw Brother Jabril said he's preoccupied at the moment, so he can't jump in and discuss the whole Thomas Sankara being Africa's Che Guevara in more detail. But I mean, I agree with that point, because that's a title that Sankara has been known by for several years now. Africa's Che, but I would argue that as Jabril argued, in my opinion, he was better than Che in certain key areas. For example, one of my main criticisms of Che Guevara is that after he left Cuba, where he was part of a successful revolutionary movement, he essentially failed to bring revolution everywhere else that he went.
This is very true.
He failed there. He tried Bolivia, and that ended up getting him killed. So I think, just as in terms of a comparative analysis, I think Sankara was a more successful revolutionary in terms of achieving what he carried out or tried to carry out doing, as opposed to Che, who was successful in Cuba but wasn't really successful much of anywhere else.
Absolutely.
But Che was a very big influence in Thomas Sankara as well. Sankara was
absolutely
really influential.
And one of the things that people may be unaware, and we don't want to move the conversation from talking about an African revolutionary iconic hero to talking about a Latino individual. But many people may be unaware that Che Guevara did grow up in a upper middle class background, if I can recall correctly. Yeah. And as a result, he really shunned, that the bourgeoisie lifestyle to engage in struggle for the people. And now, of course, this was seen as a third world struggle rather than a struggle for, of course, African people. But with that being said, I think that it is important to understand that he was someone who came from means and eschewed those means. If I recall correctly, there was even a plan at one point in his life that he would go to medical school and become a doctor.
He did, actually. Yeah, he was a doctor.
Yes. So So I've done some reading. It's been a while since I read up on Che Guevara, but I do think that that's something that we should consider. But once again, I would agree 100% that Thomas Sankara is the preeminent post-colonial African leader when it comes to implementing a revolution at the political executive level. We know many people that talk about that and they foment revolution in the streets at a grassroots level, but oftentimes I think some of the issues we are looking to actually combat have to be done from the top down. Sister Shy says, no reason why I stopped watching him. I think it was because he moved to Kenya. I'm not really into Kenya like that. Okay, no offense to the Kenyans. I know that's right? But you would like to visit. Okay, very well. So once again, we're asking the question, what can you do today to continue the revolution of African people and, of course, carry on the legacy of one Thomas Sankara, the 5th president of Burkina Faso, the land of white people? Sister Michelle, did you want to...
I just want to say thank you so much. I'm going to have to tap out. And
okay. Very good. Well, sister, I'm gonna still hit you on the cam up. And I think we're going to be going live on Friday as well. Let me look and see what the topic is going to be for Friday. Let's see here. Today is the 21st. So we have something coming up on the 23rd. We don't. But on the 24th, as I said, we're going to be having a topic. We're going to be discussing ratchet masculinity. I appreciate you, Brother Bag, for the super chat. Appreciate the super chat. Once again, I'm over 2K. Absolutely. We building, brother. We building. We know that we could get far in life, but we always bet on Black. And as Thomas Sankara taught us, we should never be ashamed of being African. But once again, on the 24th, we're going to be discussing ratchet masculinity. As you all know, we believe in duality here at Lumumba Speaks. So we're going to discuss ratchet feminism or ratchet femininity. We're also going to talk about ratchet masculinity. As I said it before, I reached out to the sister who wrote that thesis on ratchet femininity to get her to come on for a part 2. Haven't been able to do that, but I have come across another sister who has written extensively on the concept of ratchet femininity. So I'm going to reach out to that sister as well, with hopes that she could tap in and be part of a live interview where we have a second discussion regarding ratchet femininity and what it means for the Black community. But Brother Bag 676 first. Once again, I appreciate the super chat. We are over 2K. But once again, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Definitely share this channel with all the brothers and sisters. I think that what we're doing here is absolutely phenomenal. Actually, just to give a little backstory on Lumumba Speaks, my son was actually the one who implored me to create a YouTube channel. I took him to the Muhammad Ali Center for his birthday, and there was some core concepts at the Ali Center that they discussed about what it meant to be Muhammad Ali. And my son came away from that and said, you know what? Well, I think we need to create some core concepts of what it means to be a Lumumba. And of course, as many of you know, if you know my backstory, I changed my name 15 years ago. I took the surname of the Democratic Republic of the Congo's first legally elected prime minister, Patrice Emery Lumumba. And so with that being said, we wanted to live on his legacy by taking on his name, but also moving forward with that legacy as well in terms of fomenting Pan-Africanism throughout the African world. So shout out to my son if he's watching. He's tall as me now, right? So soon I'm going to be looking up to him. But with that being said, I also think it's important that we understand that here at Lumumba Speaks, we're not looking to vilify or exonerate anyone. Our goal is to simply challenge conventional thinking, to re-examine what has previously been accepted as fact. So once again, if you're watching, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button, hit the notification bell, and share. So with that being said, the link is in the chat if you want to tap in and give your perspective on what Thomas Sankara means to you, what his legacy means to you. If you have a dissenting opinion on Thomas Sankara's, his administration and his revolution, you're welcome to tap in as well. We believe, of course, in diversity of thought. And then last but not least, if you could share what you're doing today to continue the revolution in terms of helping restore African people to their traditional greatness, that would be greatly appreciated.
I just left the house here.
So I think that's someone in the background, but Dwayne is quite all right. But
yeah, so family.
Okay, very good. So yeah. We're definitely appreciative, of course, of everyone who was able to tap in this evening. But like I stated before, I felt I would be remiss in my duty to not, of course, do a show on the late great Thomas Sankara. As I stated before, he's my son's favorite Pan-Africanist. I actually learned about Thomas Sankara when I was an undergrad. In undergrad, they had, of course, the Black Student Union and the African Student Union. And I think one of the most revolutionary acts during my time with undergrad is I was able to actually foment the merging of the African Student Union and the Black Student Union to the Pan-African Student Union, literally. So, so I was the connection between two worlds, two continents, right? And I said, hey, this is bull. Why we got a Black Student Union, an African Student Union? And of course, I was able to learn from some of the faculty and staff, also known as institutional agents in the academy, that there were some issues between, of course, African students and, of course, students from the diaspora. And I said, hey, when we need to sit down and have a conversation, because we all we got, you know what I mean? I was like Nelly, dirty ENT, we all we got, right? And so was able to get the brothers and sisters to come together. And this was during a time, of course, where the Ferguson uprising took place. So I think we had the situation with not Tamir Rice, but the young brother from Florida that was killed by George Zimmerman.
Trayvon Martin.
Yeah, Trayvon Martin. And so that really galvanized the community, brought the community together. And we was able to, really ask the African Student Union, ask the Black Student Union, and create a Pan-African Student Union. So that's I guess that's a legacy that I left at my undergraduate institution. So
that's amazing. But when you mentioned that story, I was thinking about John Henry Clark in one of his lectures. He mentioned how he noticed that there were some arguments among his students. He had African students, Black American students, and Caribbean students. And how he settled it is he had each of them go out and try to catch a cab and then count the number of cabs that passed by before one stopped to pick them up. So the point he was making to the students is you're arguing among yourselves, but you're one African people, and the cab driver is a better Pan-Africanist than you are, because the cab driver doesn't care what part of Africa you're from, what state you're from, or what island you're from. He sees a black face and he keeps driving.
Wow, that's a great example. So Brother Shabazz asked, Brother Dwayne, did you go to Nigeria to get that name?
No, I'm planning to visit Nigeria, but I haven't gone to Nigeria yet. And the interesting thing about my name, actually, how it came about is I was studying African history. I just started college as an undergrad, and I knew virtually nothing but African history. So I just stumbled across the Yoruba people, and I started studying the history of the Yoruba people. And something about them just, I felt a strong connection to these people. So at the same time, I'm also, gaining consciousness, understanding the importance of African identity. I'd read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and he's dropping his last name Little to take up an X because he's not going to wear, a European slave name. So just recognizing the importance of names, I decided to give myself the name Omowale. Now, most people, when they see the name, they assume that it's influenced by Malcolm X, and that's part of it, but the name really has a deep significance to me because it represented at the time my feeling of reconnecting to home. So even though at the time I hadn't physically gone back to Africa, I viewed it as a cultural, return home, a psychological return home, and a spiritual return home. And it was only after I decided to give myself this name, and it was only after studying the history of Yoruba people that I realized many of us in the diaspora are actually descendants of the Yoruba people because of how many of them were taken in the slave trade. So to me, I almost viewed it as the ancestors reconnecting me to my roots without me knowing it, because at the time when I'm studying the Yoruba people and even taking this name, I wasn't aware of how deep the cultural how deep the cultural connection between the diaspora and the Yoruba people are, because of how many people from the Yoruba ethnic group came via slavery and how much of the culture they were able to retain.
Very good, very good. Brother Shabazz, you've tapped in. Go right ahead and share your perspective.
No, Thomas Sankara, I didn't hear about him until like a few years back. It was actually, it was Brother, what's his name? He was a teacher of mine. Obadele Kambon. It was him. Did you ever see, you familiar with him?
I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah, Dr. Obadele Kambon. Okay. Now, did you ever see, and I don't know if I want to say this, but it was a C-SPAN thing where the guy said, it's an E word, We need to white people off the face of the planet.
Oh, okay. So that's who that was.
No, that was his father.
That was his father. Okay. So yeah, I've seen that video.
Yeah, so that was Obadele Cambone's father. That was Kamal Cambone.
Okay.
And when he told that story of all that stuff, so Obadele Cambone actually went through that stuff, right? Now, today, his son, Obadele Cambone, is a teacher. He's a professor at Ghana, and he lives in his whole family, and he's repatriated. He claims he'll never come back unless it's as a part of a invading army, which is interesting. But that's also a Yoruba name. But he was the first person to put me up on him, and I did the study. So he's definitely one of the greatest Pan-Africanists, and he's someone that should always be brought up as an example of us having leaders that had integrity, because the way things are today, in the way that people frame their talking points, or the leaders are corrupt, the leaders, on without really knowing specifics and not knowing of the examples of where people weren't in extreme examples of character, like Thomas Sankara. So it's important that we know who he is and we bring him up, and we show people that it's not a matter of what we can't do, it's what we're not choosing to do, and then who we're supporting and what we're doing. That's really the issue. There's no way he should be out, and then we go on these long after him, then we go on these long spans of time after losing a man of integrity, and then we have these people who are just garbage. We can't continue to do that. So yeah, I'm glad you chose that. And then your name stood out to me because I know there's another brother named Omawale, and the main person that comes to mind, obviously, like you said, when you see that name, is Malcolm X.
Yep.
I brought that up because it's ironic because you already stated the name is The Child Returns Home,
Yep.
right?
Correct.
And that's why I was like, okay, did you go there to get the name? Or did you get it without return?
I didn't, and that's why I always used to explain to people that the reason for the name is not a physical return home, because I have since gone to the continent, but when I gave myself the name, I hadn't gone to the continent, so it represented a type of, like I said, a cultural, psychological return home, but also part of the African culture is African cultures have a naming ceremony because names are very important. The belief in many African cultures is when you give a child a name, the name almost shapes the destiny of the child. So for me, Omwale was also a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was, I haven't gone to the continent yet, but I need to fulfill my destiny. I need to live up to my name. So part of that was eventually, making my way to the continent.
Do you know how to pronounce it? Like the technical pronunciation? Have you dove into the Yoruba language yet?
I tried many years ago, but I haven't. It's very difficult to find resources on African languages. So,
well, if you're ever interested in learning Yoruba, get with me because I need I could use some some more people in on this with me.
Yeah.
If you look here, I've been on this actually. Let me show y'all some of my stuff. Hold up. Excuse my hair and all that.
That's all right, brother.
Yeah. This is my colloquial Yoruba book. You can see I done put some work in on this thing.
Yeah.
But this is a pretty good resource here. I'm going back through it on like my second time through it. I'll be doing like flashcards. You know what I mean? I got all type of flashcards, all type of like I'll do little times where I'll just like write down words and phrases and go over them just so I'm writing and saying the phrases, and then at the same time, this on both sides of these papers, right? All of this, right? And then I also took his course, which wasn't really enough. It was like a 2-week course. My daughter and I took it together. But the funny thing is, and I even got more, like this whole notebook. This is like, you can see some of my work, some of the stuff I've done in here.
Yeah.
But it's like all of that, and I still don't really speak this language, man. All of that, and I still don't really speak this language very well.
It's hard to learn a language fluently if you're not speaking it every day.
But see what okay. So when I'm at my best momentum, which included this morning, what I do is I listen. There's a phrases video on YouTube, and I listen to it. I get up, I do my workout, and when I come inside,
I mean, you ain't throwing nothing up though.
No weight.
Listen, don't get on my channel talking about you like you working out. You ain't throwing up no real weight. You know what I'm saying?
I don't even be doing up. No, I'm throwing up real weight because I'm so big. Me doing push-ups is throwing up real weight.
That's real cute, real cute. I'm messing with you. Go right ahead, brother.
No, I was playing. So yeah, after I do that, I get when I go to the shower, I bought this little $10 you can stick to the wall. It's a little $12 speaker. And then I'll just let the phrases play and then like repeat them to myself when I'm in the shower. And then I carry it with me to when I'm getting dressed and all that. And then I'm like, okay, the real goal is I'm supposed to do that to get me some passive listening. And then I'm supposed to do some, then each day I'm supposed to do some active learning, like what you see me in my notebook, going through, doing my listening exercises, doing the exercises. But the real key is consistency. If I was consistent for about 18 months straight, I think I'll be good. I will be like solidly conversational, I believe, But I say that to say, if you're looking for resources, that book is a very good resource. I would go get my dictionary, but whatever. Only reason I run to get books is because the way Lumumba does. You know what I mean? He go to get the books, go to show the proof, go to show, and I like how he does that. So I got
Yeah,
I just mine. Like I said, mine is storage, but I got some of my books here in the garage too. But anyway, I say that to say, you got dictionaries, you got this book. She also, when I finished the second go through on this book, she has an intermediate level book. Obala de Cambon at his website, what's the name of his website? Oh man, Abibi Toomey.
Okay, so I actually am familiar with that website.
Okay, yeah. You should be a member on there, and he has a course there. Now, the thing about if you're going to learn Yoruba language, his course is not going to get you very far. But his course is gonna lay an excellent foundation because he's very meticulous and strict about knowing the rules and of how you're saying it. And he lays a great foundation when it comes to the tones, because Yoruba is a tonal language.
Oh yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's a tonal language with 3 tones: low, mid, high. Right? Do, re, mi. And when you get that understanding very clear before you start, I noticed the people who have that understanding, comparing them and people who just try to just jump in and read, because it's not. They look like English words, but it's its own language.
Yeah.
It's let me see here. I know I'm kind of venturing off. I'll be done in a second.
Yeah, that's fine.
But yeah, it looks like English, but it's its own word. Like you can't. Unless you really know, I'll show y'all this. Unless you really know the phonics.
Yeah, because what I've noticed with the language is if you see it written, there's a lot of accent marks that we don't have in the English language.
Yeah, diacritic marks. Exactly, diacritical marks. Exactly, and it's only a few of them. I mean, but once you go through his class, you'll understand that, and you'll understand the tone. So. Yeah, those are some resources if you're ever ready.
Okay,
email me too. Let me know when you join this journey, man.
I appreciate it. So like I said, I tried years ago and I didn't find resources. So I end up studying Lingala because I was able to find more resources on
Lingala. Is that in
Congo, spoken Congo? In Congo,
yeah,
Central Africa.
Lingala. You found resources for that? I never even heard of that.
Yeah, I was able to find some online dictionaries.
Books?
Yeah.
Nice. What made you want to learn Lingala?
It's the story behind that is I was watching a documentary on Patrice Lumumba, and in the documentary they were playing the song Independence Cha-Cha, which was the independent song that was played at the time when Congo received its independence. It was a very popular song, and that was my introduction to Congolese music. So just over the years, listening to different Congolese songs and enjoying the music, but not necessarily knowing what's being said, that kind of inspired me to want to learn more about that language. And as I said, when I went looking, I was able to find the resources. So that was the African language I decided to study and learn more about. And it was a very eye-opening experience for me because it reinforced the fact that a lot of the speech patterns and phrases and certain words we use in the diaspora are African origin, even if we don't realize that they are.
Okay.
So I know for me, being from Ghana, I was able to see some certain connections with certain phrases we use in Guyanese Creole that's also used in Lingala as well.
Interesting.
That's a great point. I'm gonna do a show on African cultural attention.
Yeah.
Amongst the diaspora, I will come recall. I had a brother on the show who was FBA ADOS. And I know, right? Laughable. And he was like, well, our culture was completely destroyed. And I said, well, actually, that's not true. Right? I said, there's a whole literature on African cultural attention is almost a cottage industry. And so, I went all the way back to Melvin Herkovitz and his book, Myth of the Negro Past, the whole nine. Yeah. And of course, he just shut up. So, yeah.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
So, Brother Shabazz, we're posing a question in which we're honoring the 73rd birthday of one Thomas Sankara, as well as the life and legacy of Thomas Sankara, the 5th president of Burkina Faso, by asking the question, what are you willing to do today to continue the revolution?
Shoot, man. Willing to do today, as in I got to complete it today, or today as in
starting today.
You said what? I'm sorry, what?
Starting today.
Oh, starting today? That I'm not already doing?
One, you start hitting those weights, but that's a conversation for another.
I do got to hit the weights, man. I do got to hit the weights. How do I do that? How do I hit the weights? Give me a way I can hit the weights in further the African struggle. Is it a way I can combine them two things?
You know what? That is a great question. I'm so glad that you asked. So I would make the argument that being physically fit, I would just, from my perspective, that's something that my children, I could tell when they were much younger, and inspired them and made them proud. When I would show up to school or to the rec center or to youth camp to pick them up, and they would say, dang, that's your dad? And the pride that it would instill in them that, man, yeah, my dad is this buff guy who da-da-da-da-da-da. The second issue is, if it ever comes to the point to where we got to get down or lay down, right? Put somebody down and lay down, you have a better chance of being able to survive that battle if you are physically fit.
Absolutely.
But to bring that back to Sankara, we spoke about his policies concerning healthcare in Burkina Faso. He actually promoted sports and physical fitness.
Yes, he did.
You can go and find pictures of this where he's out there biking with people, playing soccer, doing different sporting events with people. So he was very much an advocate for physical fitness. So that is actually connected to a part of Thomas Sankara's legacy as well.
Absolutely.
Do I name my workout? Maybe I can name my workout segment and scheduling after him.
You can name it Body by Lumumba.
You said what?
You can name it Body by Lumumba.
Man, I got to get some services if I do that, man.
I'm messing with you.
Personal training or something.
I got you. I seen your whole workout. I used to be a trainer.
Oh yeah. Well, really, you know, it's the I gotta eat right is really what it is. You know what I mean? Yeah, I gotta eat right is really what it is, because it don't make no sense to be as out of shape as I am, and it's unacceptable for a man to be like not in shape, having a stomach and all that. It's not acceptable. So
how tall are you?
6'4".
How much you weigh?
Like 325.
Woo! You need to be an offensive guard on a football.
I was bigger. Listen, I was a Division I football player. I wasn't this heavy then.
Who did you play for?
The University of Texas at El Paso is where I graduated.
UTEP.
Yeah, UTEP. I started at Alabama. And then I left and went to junior college. And then I ended up after junior college in San Diego. I went to UTEP, and I graduated there.
Okay.
And I was
what position did you play?
I was a defensive tackle. And
okay. All right. So I'm gonna say this much. I believe in being transparent. Offensive and defensive linemen were the only people I never talked trash to on the football field. Because they were just abnormally large men. Okay. Right. And it didn't matter how much, because I'm 6 foot, about 225, right? But if you got a 300-pound man falling on top of you, I don't care how many weights you lift. You like, right. What the I was like, man, what the hell am I doing this for? Like, so I know.
That's real.
Absolutely.
Plus, like I said, I have a big frame, and I'm big, but right now I'm still overweight. So like even at that time I wasn't. Like for instance, after I graduated, I became like health conscious and stuff at a point after graduation, and I was at about what was I at? Where did I take it back? I was about it was like 310, 313. I had got to, and then I had learned about fitness and eating and calorie counting and all that stuff. And I kind of I became basically like a fanatic. Mm-hmm. And I went from it was like 313 all the way down to about 242. And when I did that, it was crazy because it was like I had an identity crisis because I was always my whole life like the big guy, you know what I'm saying? And then at that point, 242 is huge to most people, right? Right. But to me, I was wearing a large t-shirt. Like I'm wearing 3Xs and right now, right? And usually I was wearing 2Xs. I went from like 2Xs and all that to large t-shirts to much smaller waist, and I was looking big, right? But I was looking normal, and it kind of freaked me out.
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah, at that time.
It becomes part of your psyche because I can recall this was a situation in which unfortunately, I was incarcerated, right? And so you're in a county, you're being malnourished. And I got out, I had lost like 25 pounds. And so, I got out, I'm like, I go in the weight room, and I remember I put 225, but I couldn't even lift it one time. Right. And of course, it did something to my psyche. Like, I'm not the size I used to be. I'm not as big as I used to be. I don't have those problems now. I can put it up like 30 times now. Innocent plug, just dropping that out there for the folks watching. Right. But I just remember. So I understand where you're coming from in terms of your physique changes. It can have an effect on you psychologically. And I can only imagine what that does for many of our sisters in the struggle as well. So,
yeah, we're going to do a show. Matter of fact, feeling to be down there. I got to get back down there.
You know what? I love the show because I always come up with ideas for the show during our shows, and I'm gonna do a show on African body positivity. Come on now, let's get it.
Okay.
Yes. African body positivity. What does it mean? What does it look like?
I mean, you got some weight loss tips for me?
Well, I would say one, I don't know what your diet is, but I think you said dieting is an issue.
I be eating junk food. Okay, let me just answer the question. Yeah, like I'll eat junk. Like today, I just ate chicken tortilla soup, or I'll eat like little soups, or sometimes I'll eat like chicken, or I'll eat out.
So I would give you one piece of advice is don't drink any pop, don't drink any juice. I drink just water, only water. Okay. The only juice I drink is cranberry pomegranate, and I'm addicted to it, right? The only junk food I eat is potato chips. And I don't really eat those a lot, but I've had an incessant infatuation with Flaming Hot Cheetos ever since they came out in the mid-90s. So every now and then I'm like, I know I shouldn't be eating these, but but the other thing I oftentimes meal prep. So I will cook on Sundays, right? Now, they say brunch on Sundays, but I cook on Sundays, right? And I would make enough food to last throughout the week.
To last how long?
Throughout the week in terms of my dinner. And that way, when I get up in the morning, just some regular breakfast. Sometimes I do like, I go get like some, I do oatmeal. And so every breakfast, no matter what I eat, if it's like a mess of eggs, if it's turkey sausage, turkey bacon, I always have a bottle of water, a banana, and an apple. That is always a staple of every breakfast I have. Then whatever I add to that, if I'm gonna do, waffles, vegan waffles, whatever. The other issue is I also I eat fruit with every meal. So it doesn't matter if it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner. I eat fruit with every meal.
I'm an endomorph. Like carbs is tough on me when I'm losing weight.
Okay.
Yes, I don't know if I'll do the fruit, but I like those first ones. So just water and meal prep.
Yes, sir.
All right, I need to do that.
So meal prepping really helps. Also, one of the things I would do, because like I still do like a lot of heavy lifting. I had a heavy back day today. Like my back is going to be so sore tomorrow morning because I did like a really heavy back day. I was doing like 335 bent over rows. You know what that is?
Yeah.
And
that's such a good exercise, bro. Man.
Yeah, it is. And I was doing, weighted pull-ups, all type of stuff. So, but one thing I sometimes do is for snacks, I eat tuna.
Okay.
Canned tuna. I eat canned tuna for snacks. So that's something that I do as well. Also, when I go to the gym, because I go to the gym like 5-6 days a week, I always warm up with at least doing half a mile to a mile on the treadmill. Nothing crazy, maybe 7.5, 8.0 is the speed. Then typically on my off day, I would go in and just do a heavy cardio day where I'm doing sprints, 30-second sprints, because, sprinting helps tighten your core.
On the treadmill?
Yes, sir. Or sometimes I would go out to a track and I would do like 10 100s. As a matter of fact, I remember my son when he was 13, when he turned 13, he was 5'10". So he was talking trash like, yeah, you're an old man. We're gonna get out here on this track and I'm gonna dust you. So you know what happened? We got out there and I was looking like Usain Bolt on that ass. Dusted me. Get out of here. I was talking trash the whole nine. You know what I mean? So yeah, but those are just some things I do to try to stay in shape, try to stay fit. And of course, this is part of the spirit of Thomas Sankara, to be physically fit. We want to do as much as we can to be around us as long as we can. And so part of doing that is being cognizant and intentional in terms of not only our diet, but also exercise.
All right, so I need do a meal prep, and I'm 30 days just water. And
it'll probably fall off. And then of course, I still eat a hearty meal. Like today, I had some steak. I had steak, potato, some steamed broccoli. For dinner. Sometimes I'll have asparagus spears with seared salmon and a white wine spritzer. I try to be bougie every now and then. You know what I'm saying? Right. So I still eat well. I still eat good. But one thing I've cut out completely in my diet is sweet. So cakes. Even like my children, when they have their birthday and stuff, I give them cake and ice cream. I just don't eat it at all.
Okay.
So that's
the worst thing. The sugar is the worst thing for me. Yeah, that's the worst thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool. Yeah, I'm gonna implement that. I'm gonna implement those too.
Okay, because being a football player, I was one of those diva wide receivers. You know what I mean? Okay. So I cared about my physique and how I looked. I used to have, my uniform up showing my abs. So I was a diva wide receiver.
Yeah.
Look at me was you know what I mean? That's what I was on. So
right now, I feel you.
So you know how we were. Like, man, this dude don't shut up.
Right.
Throw me the ball. I was open. That's all we ever say. So
no, it's a trip to me. The way it is today because like with all them doing all this targeting and all these personal fouls and all these rules, it was like every play. My goal was to go head first, targeting and lunge into somebody and probably try to hit you directly in the head and take you out the game.
Yeah, I remember there were plays where I got blasted. I remember there were plays where I was cracking linebackers, knocking them out the game.
Right.
I remember they was like, "Man, what's wrong with this dude?" I was on one. When you talking about on one, I was on one. I used to be in the game like I wanted to fight. Like just cracking cats, like safeties, corners. Like you little, I'm about to pancake your little. I was on one. Like this dude got problems. That's what they just say. I don't think he's wrapped all the way too tight. True story, because I played semi-pro. And every game I played, I scored a touchdown. I ended up getting kicked off the team because I beat somebody up on the team.
Right.
Literally. Like I told you, I used to be out there, like literally. And I beat dude up so bad, they had to take him to the hospital. And the coach was like, yeah, you out of here. And the guy called the police. I ended up going to jail. But long story short, I'm not that person today, right? But yeah, I was there, man. But in this, we might even need to do a show because I used to box and I didn't have the type of aggression issues I had when I played football, right? Because in football, you're lifting weights and just hitting, slamming into people all the time. Boxing, even though people think is a brutal sport and it is a gladiator sport, but it takes a lot of skill and scientific thinking to be successful at boxing, right? Mm-hmm. But that's just my experience.
Yeah, boxing is like strategy, man.
Yeah.
Boxing is a great experience. I'm gonna tell you another great one is wrestling. I wrestled in high school. You ever wrestle?
I didn't wrestle, but I had a cousin that went state his senior year in wrestling, and so we used to wrestle. And as you can imagine, he used to get the best of me when we were younger. But yeah,
no, it's something about. It's funny, right? We could play football for like 2-3 hours, however long the games last.
Mm-hmm.
But 3 minutes of wrestling will kick
your ass. Same with boxing. Yeah, you'll be in that ring like, dude, when they gonna ring the bell? I just said it was only 3 minutes. You know what I mean? Literally. So absolutely,
everything out of you. Like, how to do is go 12 rounds.
Matter of fact, I still got my gloves right here.
Right.
Yeah, these are the winning gloves.
What's the longest fight you longest amount of rounds you made it?
The longest amount of rounds I went, I think I went like a 10 rounds.
10 rounds?
I
went 3 minutes?
Yeah, I remember one time I fought this dude, and of course in the amateurs it's just 3 rounds.
Yeah.
I remember like the end of the second round, he dropped me on the body shot. So I'm in there, I had to pull a Kaepernick. So I'm trying to act like I wasn't hurt. Like, I'm protesting the national anthem and shit, flag and all that type of stuff. So I get up and they like, man, you want to keep going? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, I know what I signed up for. This isn't basket weaving. We go off for the last round, and this dude is teeing off on me, trying to get me out of it. I'm still talking shit, like, yeah, you saw me. And I mean, dude, I'm so tired, like I could better keep my hands up. And dude is just trying to get me out of there, and I'm still talking trash. So I don't know, like, what's wrong with this dude, man? Like,
right.
Some issues, like for real. But that was just a motivational tactic for me.
No, I just know that's a long time, man, because wrestling is 3 rounds usually. But like when I see these guys go 12 rounds, like that takes some serious. It looks like nothing to people who have never done it before.
I know, yeah, and then to be to maintain the speed and the reflexes and everything like that, because I can recall, going rounds and I was beating a guy, and then you get tired, and then your mind starts to be lazy, then your body gets lazy. You start getting hit with shots that you normally don't get hit with. In boxing, when you get tired, you begin to hesitate. So how you used to be able to close the gap, pull the trigger, next thing you know, you're not able to close the gap and pull the trigger in that split second, and then you start getting caught with shots, and then your feet get heavy. Yeah, so it's a real issue. But I've only been down once, and I was on the body shot. I've been hit with haymakers up top, and I was never dropped, but that body shot got me.
Right. Nah, no doubt, bro.
Yeah, so but you love it though. And one thing I even put my children in boxing, and one thing I would always tell people is that boxing is a sport. You can't hide who and what you are.
Right.
If you are a coward, that's going to be readily apparent the moment you get in there. It's not something that you can hide. So, and the other thing about it, many people think, oh, you just punch someone. Boxing is 80% mental, 20% physical. It's all about your mindset.
No, it's true. It's true. I remember Mike Tyson brought that to my attention in that interview where he said, I think he was being interviewed with gloves on, and they were just talking about he's like, oh man, the ferocity and the power. He was like the most important thing is the accuracy of the punch though. And he was like, the key is you gotta accurately lay the punch, and you gotta come from an angle where they can't see the punch. Mm-hmm. That's more important than the punch, and that brought a couple things. When I learned about that, I was like, oh, okay, it's about them not seeing the punch. And because do you remember that Kimbo Slice video where he like let the guy hit him? He was like, "Go ahead."
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But
here's
you can brace for impact.
Kimbo Slice, he's passed on. He's went to the realm of the ancestors. But if he got in the ring with me, I would have beat his ass.
What made you do that?
Well, one, his technique was horrible, and two, he didn't have great hand or foot speed.
Right. But what did you think about? Did you seen it? He got a couple wins in the UFC. You see his fights?
I saw him get a couple wins in people's backyards, in which he was fighting people who were intimidated by him, and he was winning off of what? Off of a reputation. But like I said, back when I was in the gym boxing on a regular basis, I fought when I fought dudes his size before, and I stopped them, like literally won by TKO.
Right.
So like when I say this is not hyperbole, I would have got him out of there because his technique was trash. And and when you are that knowledgeable, you can set traps and just make guys run into shots.
Now
and I know how to set
fought
traps.
him backyard in the grass, bare knuckle style.
I probably would have got him out of there just off my stamina. Because like I said, the issue is he was winning off reputation. I mean, if you beat me, you're gonna have to earn it. You ain't gonna beat me off of reputation.
I mean, but why would them dudes? I don't know. You thought them dudes were scared?
You could tell by the body language.
The dude, okay, so remember the fight he did, the one I was talking about, where he let the dude hit him?
Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about.
You said you felt like he was scared.
I know he was. Because he wasn't even, he was throwing those punches. And this is why we got into this conversation, but it's rooted in what physical fitness, so we're gonna have it. But I watched it, I'm like, man, this dude's scared of him. Like literally. Like, and this is what I was taught in boxing. Whenever somebody does that, hit them in the stomach. This is what we were taught. Don't ever go for the head. Blast that body.
Oh, if somebody give you a free shot?
Yep, that's what we were taught.
If it's bare knuckle, I'm going for your nose. If you give me a free shot, I'm going for the center of the nose right here. Because you could brace this up. You can't brace up this soft thing right here.
Right.
So you give me a free shot like that, because me hitting you in your chin and you're bracing for impact means nothing.
Right.
That means nothing.
But like I said, I remember there was a situation. I was going through something. I was extremely upset. So I told my son, like, hey, I'm going to the gym and I'm fighting the biggest dude in there. So I go in there. I fought one of them folks. And dude was like 6'4", 250, 260. We get in there. He like, yeah, can you give me some work? He like, yeah. Man, I ran through that dude like a girl with low self-esteem. And this is no cap, no lie. Like, true story. Like to the point we ended up going 2 rounds because they stopped it. He didn't land one punch.
Right.
And at the time, like I said, I'm 225 now. I was only 200 at the time. So, like I said, this is true story, man. Like I just know, because when I first started boxing, I would be in there with guys who were like 175, and they would give me work because they were more skilled. They knew how to set traps, the whole nine. And so when I was in there and I learned how to do that, I'm like, oh, I used to be overconfident, like, oh, this is easy work. And I knew I could take a punch, like, oh, this is nothing. I fight him, get him in there. Matter of fact, turn IG live on. I want everybody to see this. Because you just know how to. Unless somebody's on your level, it's almost to the point to where I could tell what mistakes the guy is making just from his stance. Literally. When you're in it, it's like playing football or playing basketball. If you got a guy who isn't a great defender, you can tell right away how you can score on him.
You can see the weakness, like when you start to size him up and dribble. I can already see. I'm like, okay, he's gonna fall for the crossover, or he's weak. He's weak. You know what I mean? I go back and forth. You can feel it. It's funny. It's funny that when I hear fighters say that, I think of basketball, because you can feel which way to go. It's hard to explain, but you can feel it. Like, okay, I'm going left. You can feel it. You can tell when somebody's balance is off. You know? Yeah.
And Brother Bag is saying stamina is different for boxing and wrestling. Body shots are always best lens chest to break in your hand. And the other issue for me was I like breaking guys down. Because I fought at heavyweight, I always fought guys who were bigger than me, 20, 30 pounds. And I like breaking a guy down systematically over time. And you do that with body shots.
You said boxing is like chess. That's true.
Yeah. And before you know it, you start baiting guys into different shots, the whole nine. So I loved it. I mean, now I've been boxing like 3.5, 4 years. And part of the reason was I had partially tore my rotator cuff. I went through rehab, got back right, got into the ring. And of course I was a bit rusty, but I also noticed I didn't have the reflexes that I used to. And I was getting hit with some shots that I normally don't get hit with. So I was, but I loved being in there. Matter of fact, I remember when I first moved to Columbus, I fought this dude. We went 8 rounds. And he had been boxing since he was a kid. So he probably won 6 or 7 of the rounds. But I was landing the heavier shots, like when Chavez fought Meldrick Taylor. And I remember I got tired and I just started talking trash. Like, this is the best the 614 got. You punch like a bitch. I was just talking reckless. And it's like kids in the gym the whole nine. Like, we in the ring going at it. And he was like, dude, what is wrong with you? I said, I just had to motivate myself. Don't take it personal. It's, and then after I was like, you my new best friend. We got to spar all the time. So, but it was just something that I loved. And I gained a love of boxing from when I was a young child as well. So.
No, it's a good sport.
Yeah.
It's a really good sport. My daughter does it, but she hasn't had a fight yet.
Okay.
Yeah, she hasn't had a fight yet. And I think I think I'm gonna have to encourage them to let her at least go through with a fight, because what's the point? You've been doing this for so long. Right.
Yeah, at some point it's gotta be put up or shut up.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, at some point it gotta be put up or shut up. So I think let me see if I can find a picture of my little one when she was in her boxing gear. But go right ahead, brother.
She about the same age. My daughter 13. How old your daughter?
My daughter will be 13 next month.
Okay, yeah. My daughter 13 in March. So she about a year older.
Okay, cool.
About a year older. What you buying your kids for Christmas?
I don't celebrate Christmas.
Okay, I was just checking.
Nothing. I know you was messing with me. I know. So yeah, the answer is nothing. Yeah. Absolutely nothing. But yeah, we do Kwanzaa though.
I've never done Kwanzaa. I like we do. I've never done the full thing. You know what I mean, with the candles and maybe I should do it this year.
Maybe we do it every year. It's been every year for us.
Yeah, no, I've never done Kwanzaa.
Yeah, every year we've done Kwanzaa. So
we go to the events and stuff like that. If you ever come to San Diego, every Kwanzaa is done at the World Beat Center. They always have some good stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll go there, but no, I never done Kwanzaa.
Okay.
What's your opinion on people saying that the guy is a government agent and all that stuff?
Well, I mean, so some of this is rooted in the old, and Brother Dwayne, please feel free to tap in. But part of this is rooted in the old schism between the US organization and the Black Panther Party, right? So a lot of this information where people are saying he was an agent, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, during COINTELPRO, both groups were making the argument that each were agents and actually working to the interests of the white power structure. The second issue is shout out to the Empress Love. Appreciate you, sister, tapping in. Absolutely. Karinga went to prison for 5 years. Agents don't go to prison. If you're an agent, you get off scot-free. We saw this with the Marcus Garvey case, when Garvey and 3 of his associates or 2 of his associates were all tried for mail fraud. Garvey was the only person who was found guilty. So that is not rooted in facts. But many people take umbrage with Karinga because, as we know, he went to prison due to the fact that there was a Black woman who was part of the organization who was tortured. And they believed that she was an agent and she was tortured. And of course, he was found guilty. He wasn't present when the young lady was being tortured. But if anyone is familiar with how he ran his organization, nothing took place without his authorization. He was a bit what we like to call autocratic, for the lack of better words. And that's one of the issues that many people have with him. But I think the biggest issue we must understand when we talk about Kwanzaa, that Kwanzaa is a non-heroic, non-religious holiday. So it's not a celebration of any particular person. It's not a celebration of any particular religion. And we're celebrating the principles, right? And of course, the best of what it means to be African and human. And with that being said, these principles that we are practicing, self-determination, unity, cooperative economics, collective work and responsibility, creativity, purpose. Yes, these principles have been around long before Maulana Karinga ever walked face on the earth.
Yeah, I mean, now agents can go to prison though, undercover, and then an agent can be presumed to go to prison and not actually be there.
Right, but now he was there though. He was
right,
there.
Right.
Yeah.
Just for the record though.
Yeah. This, and you're right about that. But yeah, he was actually there.
Yeah.
And I show you.
Yeah, actually, I have his. So I actually on my. So I had something where I was covering things in the community. You know, I had a platform where I was covering things in my local community, and he actually came to San Diego, and I recorded his live stream, bought his book, and I have a signed book from him.
Okay, very good, very good. So
he seemed cool in person.
Yeah, I just posted that picture of my daughter that was in her. I could put it back up in her boxing gear when she was.
Oh yeah. Bring that back up. I was talking.
Yeah, but she didn't like getting hit. You know what I mean? So my son, because reason why she wanted to box is because her brother was boxing.
Okay.
And yeah, she was like, hey, he got a mouthpiece. Why don't I have a mouthpiece? And so on and so forth. But the major issue came when she started getting hit. She was like, okay, this isn't for me. So
what do you think about female boxing?
I'm a big fan of it.
Okay.
Big fan of it. I mean, as a matter of fact, I watched the first all-female card that took place in London back in, I think, October at the O2 Arena, in which it was headlined by Carissa Shields, where she was able to win the undisputed middleweight championship. And then, of course, our sister out of Detroit, Sister Baumgartner, who was able to win the, if I remember correctly, the junior lightweight unified championship. So I am a boxing fanatic. I'm a hardcore fan. I have a subscription to Ring Magazine, which, of course, is considered the Bible of boxing. And I'm going to be doing a show in a couple of weeks on the racialized politics of boxing, why boxing matters, examining the racialized politics of the squared circle.
Right. Shoot. Well, all right, brother. I'm gonna get back to work, man. I gotta get this money up, man. Africa trips ain't cheap.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Absolutely. So appreciate you tapping in. Once again, we want to appreciate everyone to tap in. We're gonna give last words to Brother Dwayne, our resident historian here at Lumumba Speaks. Right, he is the preeminent Pan-Africanist historian that I've ever met in my life. So definitely gracious to have the brother on the show. Make sure you go to his channel, follow him on YouTube as well. But I'm gonna give you last words before we close out.
Yeah. So closing thoughts, I would just reiterate the point they made earlier that in my personal opinion, I think Thomas Sankara was the best post-colonial leader Africa has seen. And I think moving forward, if we're serious about continuing his legacy and building on the legacy that he left behind, it entails taking a very holistic approach to the liberation of our people. We spoke about different, aspects of life in Burkina Faso that Thomas Sankara improved, whether it was health via improving healthcare or, advocating for the improvement of personal fitness, whether it was raising literacy, whether it was taking care of the material conditions in the people in the sense of having leadership self-sacrifice. So, maybe cut government salaries so that we can afford programs to benefit our people, maybe drive cheaper vehicles so we can afford policies, afford to take care of our people in that way. We spoke about the cultural component of what he was doing. So he took a very holistic approach, and obviously as well educating children in addition to educating adults. So I think what we can learn from Thomas Sankara is the importance of taking a holistic approach to the liberation of our people and being completely and wholly committed to the liberation of our people, to the point where, as I said, Thomas Sankara was the type of leader who was self-sacrificing, although I would imagine in his mind it wasn't really a sacrifice because he was very happy to do what he was doing for the people. So that's the legacy that Thomas Sankara has left to us, and I think it's up to us to build on that legacy by rebuilding the Pan-African movement, because I think the movement from the 1960s to the 1980s, early 90s definitely took a huge blow because we lost leaders like Sankara, and unfortunately we haven't replaced those leaders. So I would say we need to rebuild the Pan-African movement by adopting the type of holistic vision and approach that Sankara had.
Wonderful, wonderful. Appreciate you, brother. You all know what to do. Make sure you hit the subscribe, like button, thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. Hit that notification bell and share with all the friends and well wishers. Till next time, y'all know what to do.